All right, so anyone who buys a camera does so for one reason. They want to capture amazing images. I don't think there's a single person out there who buys a camera and says, I think I'll go out today and take some mediocre images. The biggest obstacle most people face when starting out in photography is they have an image in their mind they really want to capture, but they don't know how to get it with their camera. And maybe they look online or in a book, but then it gets complicated or frustrating, or you just can't find the right answer, and then they decide they just can't do it, and they leave their camera on auto mode, or they leave it on the shelf and don't go out and take photos like they should. There isn't a single person watching this who can't take great photos. And if you've tried other courses or online learning and it didn't work out how you expected, don't worry. I know that things can get overcomplicated quickly, and some teachers can be so technically advanced that they forget what it was like to be at the beginning of the journey and how important it is to teach the essentials which all excellent photos come from in a way that anyone can understand. And I don't care if you have the nicest camera in the world. If you don't know the things I'm teaching you in this course, whether you learn them from me or not, you're never going to be able to use your camera to its full potential to capture the images you wish you could. Now in this course, I'm teaching you the essentials of photography that you can build a hobby, a passion, or a career on. I'm going to go step by step so you never get lost, each lesson building on the last, avoiding overly technical explanations and focusing on actually taking photos. And I'll be repeating the important things over and over and over to help you develop a muscle memory for photos. I'll also be showing you lots of different examples in different locations and different lighting scenarios to help you think with them. Really, this course is the course I wish I had when I was starting in photography 30 years ago. Since then, I've easily spent $10,000 to $20,000 in seminars, classes, books, online training, as well as one-on-one mentoring to learn photography and cinematography. I've also spent tens of thousands of hours practicing my craft so that I can actually do everything professionally at a high level that I'm going to be teaching you in this course. Now, this course isn't going to save you the thousands of hours of practice it takes to become truly proficient as a photographer, but it is going to save you the thousands of hours most people waste doing the wrong things or taking photos that could have been better. Yes, I'll be playing with a Canon camera for this course, but I also shoot with Sony, Nikon, Red, Arri, Leica, Panasonic, and even smartphones. Everything I teach you in this course applies to whatever camera you have. What you really have to have is a desire to learn and become a better photographer. A camera with a lens, something to take a photograph that isn't moving, like a vase full of flowers, something to take a photograph that can move, like a toy like this, and just a few hours of your time. So here's the real question. Do you want to become a better photographer? Good. Then let's get started. All right, so let's talk really quick about how I want you to study this course. Now, when I'm teaching photography, whether it's in person or via video format, I like people to have the camera, a lens, and flowers or something that they can photograph really easy without getting up and leaving the room. Because the moment you get out of your chair, who knows when you're going to get back to continuing on these videos. So I'm assuming you have a professional or a semi-professional DSLR and at least one lens, maybe more. So take your camera, get it off auto, put it on manual mode, and just follow along. Don't worry about getting everything perfect right now. I just want you to understand each of the concepts that I'm going over with you and that you actually get it and it clicks in your head. So if you focus on getting everything perfect, you might get frustrated. Just follow along with the general understanding. The other thing I wanted to mention is don't skip around on the course. One of the biggest problems that you'll have learning photography online or via blogs or information that's spread out is a lot of time the people who are talking about photography, they'll jump from one subject that you're trying to learn into a subject that you haven't learned yet. And this can be really frustrating because you're trying to understand something that you don't understand and suddenly someone says 5 other things that you don't understand and you give up in frustration. So I have designed this course so that I take you on baby steps from one concept to the next. And I'm gonna say things multiple times, probably to the point where you might even get frustrated with it, but trust me, just like Alice in Wonderland said, if I tell you 3 times, it's true. I think that's where God said. Anyways, I'm going to repeat things multiple times so that you build it as a memorization factor, and it's just built and becomes part of your muscle memory. So also, as I'm doing this course, we're going to be bouncing around in a lot of different locations. And I'm doing that, one, so you don't get bored of just seeing me sit here talking, but two, also so that you can actually look at the light in different scenarios. I really want you to start obsessing over light. So I'm going to try and get just a bunch of different lighting situations and a bunch of different locations so that you can actually practice looking at the light in a scene, and it'll give you a bunch of different examples to compare things to. Okay, so with all that said, let's go ahead and let's get started on the first actual lesson of this course. So what is shutter speed and how does it control exposure? First off, fully understanding shutter speed could really be a course in itself. But in this course, I just want to equip you with enough working knowledge to make you dangerous. If you want more later, you can always tackle that in another course or look online. So don't worry, I'll keep it simple and I'll stick to the essentials. So what's shutter speed? The one sentence answer is that shutter speed is how long the shutter is open to allow light to hit the recording surface in your camera. All right, so now let's talk about this in more detail. So you've got a recording surface in your camera set for a particular sensitivity as your first step. Now you have to let the light hit it. How long you let the light hit it for, again, will determine your exposure. The shutter on your camera opens and closes to shut out light, and how fast you tell it to do that is the shutter speed. Simple, right? Now many cameras no longer actually have a physical shutter. The sensor simply turns on and off for the amount of time you tell it to. All shutter speeds are related to seconds of time as its reference. Many cameras these days have shutter speeds that go from 1/8,000th of a second to 30 seconds or longer. To put 1/8,000th of a second in perspective, it takes most people about 3/10ths of a second to blink. Do the math, and holy photographic speeds, Batman. It's fast. So how does shutter speed relate to exposure? So if the shutter is open for too long and you let in too much light, the image can again be overexposed. Now if it isn't open long enough and not enough light gets in, the image can be underexposed. And what we're looking for again as photographers is the Goldilocks of exposure, where it's just right to get a perfect exposure. So I'm going to go ahead and leave my ISO at ISO 500. The only thing I'm going to be changing on the camera is the actual shutter speed itself. So let's see how this affects the light. So this is going to be 1/2000th of a second, and we're probably not going to see anything at all, which we don't. Okay, we're going to go down to 1/1000th. Just now starting to see something. We're going to go down to 1/500th. Starting to come in. Now we're going to drop down to 1/250th. Good. Go ahead and look out that way, like up at that tree. Maybe kind of lean against it a little bit. Okay. So that's at 1/125th, and that's actually the right exposure. It actually looks pretty good. So now we're going to do too much. Now, as you can see, actually, there's a little bit of light from the water itself bouncing in her face, which kind of makes for an interesting sort of fill, but it's a little too much. So let's go ahead and let's have you scrunch down on your, like, give me a little pose like that. Okay, so now, let me see what we have here. Okay, that looks really good. This is at, so now you're going to see as I increase the shutter speeds, it's going to go over to overexposure. So this is 1/60th, okay? And then just kind of look up. There you go. Okay, and now we're going to go even lower at 1/30th. It's getting completely blown out now. 1/15th. And it's completely gone. So, but if I go back to where I was at 1/160th, give me that, what you did again with your hand, just kind of like lightly right there. Good. Turn and look just a tiny bit more towards over here where the camera is. Awesome. That looks amazing. So you remember how when ISO was doubled from ISO 100 to ISO 200, that in essence it gave you twice as much light? And that some of the ISO standards at the beginning was ISO 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, each time the light sensitivity doubling from the previous number? It's actually similar in shutter speeds. The standard shutter speeds went something like 1/2000th, 1/1000th, 1/500th, 1/250th, 1/25th, 1/60th, 1/30th, 1/15th, and so on. What I'm really just trying to make sure you see here is that when you change the shutter speed, it's changing the exposure of the image because it's changing how much light is in. Well, here's the little gotcha that people sometimes miss. When you go from 1/60th of a second to 1/125th of a second, you are cutting the light in half because the shutter is open for half the amount of time. So less time open, less light in. So some people easily understand this and others just need to practice with it for a bit until they get the hang of where it's more light and where it's less light, which way the numbers are moving. Now, I know I'm over-explaining this, but it's crucial that you understand the small details of these concepts. Once you get it, it's dead simple. Just remember that shutter speed has to do with fractions of a second. So as the numbers increase from 1/1000th to 1/2000th, the amount of time the shutter is actually open decreases, hence less light. All right, so I know that thinking in speed and light and all that can bend your brain at first. But just remember, the slower the shutter speed, the more light gets let in the camera, the brighter the image. And then the higher the ISO, the more light, the brighter the image. If you practice with this, you will get it. So now I want you to practice setting different shutter speeds so you start getting a feel for it. So go ahead and set your camera onto manual mode. And then what I want you to do is I want you to put your ISO, if you've got a setting there on your camera, if you're in daylight, it should be at around 100. Okay? Then what you're going to do is you're going to go ahead and you're going to figure out which dial on your camera controls shutter speed. Now, I don't know if you have a Leica, a Canon, a Nikon, what you have, but here, this is controlling my shutter speed. As you can see, I'm going from 1/15th all the way here. So go ahead and start up at 1/800th of a second at ISO 100. Just take note of the image. This one is actually really dark. You don't see much of anything. Then I want you to go ahead and drop it down to the next setting, which in this case would be 1/640th. Okay, you'll see that it's slightly brighter. Then you're going to go ahead, drop it down a couple more. This is 1/400th, still pretty dark. So now I'm going to drop it down to 1/200. Still pretty dark, but starting to get there. So now I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to drop it down to 1/100th. Okay, getting there. Now I'm going to go to 1/60th. Okay, and that actually looks pretty good as I can see it on my screen here. Now it's always easy to stick your camera on auto mode and take a photo and look and go, oh, okay, this is a nice exposure. But what I'm trying to teach you on this course is how to take control of your camera. And that means learning to use the manual mode and learning to use the different settings on your camera. So go ahead and just take photos of your little flowers or whatever it is. Make sure you're in manual mode on your camera. Make sure your ISO is at the lowest, maybe around 100, and then just practice changing shutter speeds until you get the feel for faster shutter speeds, meaning less light, slower shutter speeds, meaning more light. Nowadays, there are a lot of cameras using electronic shutters, which means that your camera is going to have a ton of settings of shutter speed. And it's fine. Set whatever shutter speed you want. I just want you to get that the faster the shutter speed, the less light, and the slower the shutter speed, the more light. Once you clearly understand this and you have a feel for it taking photos of your flowers, the next thing I want to talk to you about is the problem related to longer shutter speeds. And this is called motion. Again and again, I'm going to ask you to think differently about photography and to rise above the obsession with the camera gear itself, which can be a real problem when you're just starting. Your camera is just a tool to tell stories. It's not an end-all in itself, so don't obsess over it. I want you to reprogram your mind to think about light and story first, to understand that you can actually control light and figure out how to use it no matter what the situation is that you find yourself in. And then once you figure that out, you'll know what to do with your camera. Remember first that a photograph is a communication from you to the viewer. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and generally before you sit down to write 1,000 words, you think a little bit about what you want to say. So I want you to constantly think about what the message is of the photos you want to take. When you're starting in photography, the message can be as simple and specific as, we had fun today at the park, or wow, look how cute my kid is, or just look at this awesome landscape. But you're going to find that as you get deeper and deeper into photography, you will see that you can say things with photos in an instant that words could never fully convey. But it's still all about telling stories. An amazing thing about photography is that the photograph doesn't have to be an exact impression of real life. Using different tools and techniques, you can write many different stories with the light your camera is capturing. You can show the world very differently from how the human eye might casually see it. You can show people things in ways they have never seen before, even if they have seen it in person 1,000 times. But there is a big difference between taking pictures and being a professional at it. Just because you have a camera, it doesn't make you a professional photographer. Being a professional comes from learning and practice. Lots of both. So photography comes from the words photo, meaning light, and graphy, meaning writing. With photography, you write with light. In all the locations I'm going to show you on this course, I'm just kind of showing up with not really like a real plan or a real scout. I'm taking some photos to show you. So I'm going to look and see what the light is and how I can tell a visual story using it, and I'm going to show you some photos and what does or doesn't work about them. I'm pretty sure I'll get photos that I like and that I'm happy with and will work to show you with what I'm trying to teach you. I don't know if I'm going to get mind-blowingly great shots, but that's not going to let me stop from trying. My point is this: no matter what the natural lighting situation is, you can still get better photos by knowing how to really use your camera and not just leaving it in auto mode. So true photographers are experts in telling stories with their camera. Stories that transport the viewer to different locales, show them parts of the world and life that they never knew existed. But, and this is a big but, for a photograph to exist at all, one very important thing must have happened: that a surface which can record light is exposed to light. And this brings us to the subject of exposure. What is exposure, really? All right, so similar to shutter speed, depth of field could be an entire class in itself. But what I want to do with this course is give you a working knowledge of the essentials. Usually when I'm explaining depth of field for the first time to someone, I like to tell them to think about it as depth of focus. Because again, we're talking about how deep the area of what is in focus is, or what is acceptably sharp. So, what is depth of field? The one sentence answer: depth of field refers to the distance between the closest and farthest point that can be considered acceptably in focus or sharp in an image. Now let's go over this in a little bit more detail. We now know that a lens can only be truly and precisely focused at one point at any one time. However, there will be varying degrees of sharpness to the front and to the back of that precise focal point. It is those degrees of sharpness that determine how deep or how shallow your depth of field is. Let's go ahead and look at this again with the tape measure example, because it will help make the point. Now, I'm not going to change the focus. The only thing that I'm going to be changing on this shot is the aperture. And again, I'm using a Canon 50mm lens. Any brand will have a good 50mm lens that has a very low aperture. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to put this all the way down to f1.4. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to focus on the number 16. So you can see that there's very little that is in focus to the front or the back of the 16-inch mark. So now let's go ahead and we're going to go up to 2.8, and you'll see that there's more that's in focus to the front and back of that mark. F4, and again, more is in focus in front and more is in focus in the back. And we'll go ahead to F8 just as our last one, because I think you get it. And again, you can see that more is in focus to the front and more is in focus to the back at, again, a higher aperture number. But I also want you to look at the photograph and notice that it gets gradually more out of focus this way and gradually more out of focus this way. There's not a precise point where suddenly it's in focus and out of focus. It's very gradual. So that distance from where it's acceptably sharp in the photo is the depth of field. So when photographers are doing portraits and close-up shots, they often use a shallow depth of field because they only want the viewer to focus on the face or the person in the portrait. This is also called shallow focus because the area considered acceptably in focus is very shallow. Now this is a beautiful location. We're at Matador Beach, and a portrait doesn't just have to be only of the face. Some people think that, but full body shots are also portraits. Because look at the difference between doing a full body shot with everything in focus with a deep depth of field, or having the background slightly out of focus with a shallower depth of field. Do you think it makes for a more flattering portrait? This is why shallow depth of field is used in a lot of portrait photography. By using a shallower depth of field, you allow the viewer to focus their attention on what you want them to focus their attention on. It's a very powerful creative tool for the photographer and cinematographer. It's also a good way to tone down or get rid of a distracting background. It really just depends on what you're trying to achieve. So if you want people looking at the model, think about it. You might want to blur out the background So it's out of focus while the model is in focus. Then the people are going to be looking at her and not just all the graffiti. But in capturing landscapes, panoramas, and architectural type shots, we almost always want a very deep depth of field so that almost everything is in focus. This allows the viewer to be transported to vast spaces with tons of intricate details that they can look at and find something new in with each viewing. This isn't really a vast landscape, but the light is kind of nice right now. Over this way, there's actually a little bit of a nice shot too. This is also called deep focus because the area considered acceptably in focus is very deep. Notice that both the front light post and the back light post are all sharply in focus. Now, before I go more into depth of field, there's something we need to make sure you have straight so that you don't have any confusion on this, because a lot of photographers just starting out usually have this same thing backwards, just like I did when I was starting. So one common misconception I hear people saying a lot is they want a fuzzy background with lots of depth of field, which doesn't really make sense, right? Because fuzzy or blurred backgrounds come from very little or very shallow depth of field. Now that fuzzy or blurred background people are referring to is usually called by the Japanese name bokeh, or some people say bokeh, but bokeh I believe is the correct pronunciation. Bokeh is very evident when you have a very shallow depth of field. You can usually see a lot of bokeh on close-up photos of products, plants, insects, and portraits. Now bokeh actually refers to the quality of the area that a lens renders out of focus, and this can change from lens type to lens type. There can even be unique bokeh effects created by certain types of specialty lenses, like where the little points of light in the background show up as hearts. Interesting, but available. Now, different lenses create different types of bokeh. And I don't want to get too complex here, but generally speaking, the shallower the depth of field, the more out of focus the background will be, okay? So don't say fuzzy background with lots of depth of field, ever. Just kidding. Anyways, back to depth of field, you get the basic idea, right? Shallower depth of field, less is in focus. Deeper depth of field, more is in focus. So how do you control depth of field? Well, there are a number of different ways, but let's start by talking about the one that led us here, aperture. All right, so what is light sensitivity? Well, the simple answer is it's just how strongly the film or sensor reacts to light. The more sensitive it is, the less light it needs to have a properly exposed image, and this is controlled by the ISO setting on your camera. ISO stands for International Standards Organization. Let's get a little bit more into this. In the early days of photography, there was a problem, which was that the chemicals that were being used to capture the image took a lot of time to get enough light on the film so that you would have a properly exposed image. This made it very difficult to get sharply focused pictures, as things do tend to move, and it's hard to sit perfectly still for 5 seconds, let alone for a minute. And the camera also had to be perfectly still, so photographers could not hold them by hand and get a sharp shot. Hello, tripods. This is actually where the expressions for slow and fast film came from. The more sensitive the film was, the faster you could get a properly exposed image. The less sensitive the film was, the slower it was considered because it took longer to get a properly exposed image. So those type of films were called slow. For almost 200 years, there's been a constant evolution on two fronts. The first has been to give photographers tools to artificially create more light and better control the light that they have. You've seen these type of things. They're flashes, they're studio lights, they're pieces of silver and white that can bounce light onto the scene. The second has been to get film and now digital sensors more and more sensitive so less light is needed to get a properly exposed image. There are now digital sensors that are so sensitive it can see a clear image in what our eyes perceive as almost pure darkness. This shot in the desert is lit only by moonlight, which is crazy. So the way that you go ahead and increase sensitivity on your camera is done by the ISO setting. And here's that word ISO again. What does it mean? ISO stands for International Standards Organization. And to make this simple, a long time ago, there were a bunch of different numbers and a bunch of different abbreviations in all sorts of different parts of the world. So this was pretty confusing. And basically an international committee said, we're going to simplify this. So they created an international standard, and this made it simple for photographers everywhere to know what kind of film they were getting. They knew that an ISO 100 film was a film that was for bright daylight shooting, and the higher the numbers went, the more sensitive to light the film was. If you really want to know the math and how all these numbers mean what, you can check it out online, but really do it right before you go to bed because it's going to put you to sleep. Now, it used to be that film was available with ISO numbers that doubled, meaning you would go from ISO 100 to ISO 200 to ISO 400 to ISO 800 to 1600 and 3200. And what was happening is you knew that with each increase of ISO, you were getting double the amount of light because the sensitivity was increasing by double. But nowadays, most digital cameras have ISO ranges which split that into much finer amounts. You can find that you have much finer control over your ISO with smaller stops and with ISO ratings that go up to 25,600 and even into the hundreds of thousands, which is ridiculous. So when you crank up your ISO, it's kind of like how photographers used to switch to higher ISO films that were more sensitive, so you were seeing more light in your image, except there was never a film that was as sensitive or went as high as the ISO does on newer cameras. And now you can actually handhold cameras for most shots, which in times past would have needed a tripod, which is very handy. All I'm going to show you here, and I'm not going to change any other setting on the camera other than ISO, because I just want you to see how sensitivity affects this image. So let's start with some daylight images. And remember, this is just to show you how ISO affects the image. Okay, so let's have a look at our patiently waiting model over here. Okay, so now I am at ISO 100. And as you can see, it's way too dark for this image. Okay, so now what we're gonna do is we're gonna go up to ISO 200. Okay, now we're going up to 500. And you can see the image is getting brighter and brighter, and that actually looks pretty good. But now I'm just gonna go ahead and go even higher, up to ISO 800. Now I'm gonna go up to ISO 1250. Okay, and as you can see, it's now no longer looking like a proper exposure. Okay, good, now look over your left shoulder. Okay, good. Thank you. But now let's try capturing an image at night. There is less available light overall. So at ISO 100, it's going to be very dark. But as I start going up through the ISOs, 200, 400, 800, you'll start to see it starting to get overexposed until it's completely and totally blown out. So do you see that ISO is a tool and that its setting depends on how much light you have available to get a good exposure? And you might think that if you don't have enough light, you can just crank the ISO as high as you want it because these new sensitive cameras. But there is a problem with that. Do you know what it is? It's called noise. Exposure in its simplest definition is talking about the amount of light you have allowed to reach and be captured by the sensor, or film, to reveal the details and parts of the image you are trying to capture in an image and show to the viewer. Let's go into this in a little bit more detail. So the longer explanation. You know what exposure as a word means, right? You've come into contact with something. You've seen it, or two or more things have interacted with one another. Well, exposure as a photographic term goes all the way back to the old days of photography, before film was even invented, and you just had a wooden box, which was your camera, with a lens that had something to cover the hole, which was your shutter, and inside was a plate of glass that had chemicals coated onto its surface that reacted to light. The chemicals were exposed to the light. And photographers had to time how long they had to let the chemicals be exposed to light by holding the shutter open on their cameras, sometimes just with their hand, for that amount of time. If they did a bad job, it was either too dark or too light. If they did a good job, the photo would be a decent representation of what they saw through the lens or what they were seeing in front of the camera in terms of brightness and details. If an image is too dark overall, it is said to be underexposed because the recording surface hasn't been exposed to the light long enough to properly capture the image information, and so information is lost and cannot be gotten back. Now, if an image is overall too bright, it is said to be overexposed because the recording surface has been exposed to light for too long and information is lost and cannot be gotten back. And if the image looked good, with the right amount of lighting in the right areas, it was said to be a good exposure, or that it had been properly exposed to reveal the details the photographer wanted revealed. Maybe not everything was captured just because of the sensitivity of the chemicals, but the important parts that the photographer wanted captured by the camera were captured. Exposure is just as important now as it was 150 years ago. Why? because digital works on the exact same principles. Instead of exposing chemicals to light, you're exposing the surface of a digital sensor inside your camera that translates light into digital information that can be reproduced on a computer. The goal of the photographer or cinematographer is always to have the perfect exposure for the message of the image that he or she is trying to communicate. That doesn't mean that everything is evenly exposed. There are plenty of cases where you wouldn't want this. So a dark exposure isn't necessarily bad. Exposure also means that you have to decide what the viewer is to see and what they are not to see. So have a look at this image where I'm going to go ahead and silhouette the model kind of under this pier, looking out at a boat. So it's a very dark image on her, but the details being revealed are what I want you to see. It's not underexposed, it's the correct exposure for this image where I'm trying to get a silhouette. Now, a lot of time your teacher will jump right in and tell you that there are 3 main ways to control your light using your camera. The first is the sensitivity of the sensor inside the camera that is recording the light. In today's digital cameras, you can change the sensitivity of the sensor radically, and this will really change the exposure you get. 2, the speed at which the shutter opens and closes. This is called shutter speed. 3, the size of the opening in the lens which lets light through onto the sensor. The bigger the opening, the more light that gets let in. But again, I want to remind you to think of light first. Before you think about any of your camera settings or your lens settings, ask yourself if you're happy with the light you're about to capture. Really look at your light and remember that even at the simplest level, you do have some degree of control over it. Now let's look at this with our lovely model here, and I'm going to show you what I'm talking about. Now, if you look right now, she's standing in some very harsh sunlight. So as you can see what's happening in terms of the shadows on her face. If I was to take a photo here, okay, hold on. The light ends up being really harsh on her skin and on her face just because of that's the sunlight that we have. So, go ahead. Okay, tweaking my settings here. Taking a photo like that, the light is very strong and harsh, and that's not really pleasing for skin. So when it comes to controlling light, to make sure you have the best shot that you can get, realize just by moving your model or whatever you're photographing into a different area, you can get a much better, much softer look. So we're gonna go ahead and walk over here to this table. Come on over. So now if you see, the light is much softer over here. As you can see, there's like a little bit of light falling on the back of her head. It's just kind of coming through the trees, which is really nice. And this is really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about controlling light. It's don't just take the light that you get, see how you can get the best light that's there. So now I'm going to take another photo and just kind of show you what this looks like in terms of photographically, just changing from full bright to shade. Okay. Nice, good. And now just look a little bit that way. There you go. Okay. So now if you look at the photos, you're going to see that the light on her skin is much more pleasing and it's much more flattering for her as a model and for the photo you're taking. So there's obviously less light in the shade. There was way more light in the sun, but now that we've moved her over here, the exposure is very different and a very different effect of the light on her skin and how she looks overall. Now remember, because the most vital factor that affects exposure is, of course, how much light and what type of light is present. I know, I keep saying it, and I promise I'll stop stressing this so much at some point. So now that I've reminded you again that examining the light comes first, and then monkeying with the settings you have on the camera, let's talk about monkeying with the settings on the camera, starting with the first one, sensitivity to light, or ISO, or as some people call it, ISO. So what is focal length? Well, you often hear people calling lenses like this is a 24mm lens, or this is a 50mm lens, or it's an 85mm, or it's a 200mm. Well, that number that they're talking about is a lens's focal length. And the one-sentence answer is, focal length is the distance between the optical center of your lens when it's focused at infinity and the surface of the sensor or film in your camera. So that probably didn't really clear things up for you. So let's go into this in a little bit more detail. Basically, The focal length is just a measurement of how far a piece of glass at a certain point in your lens is from the very front of your sensor. Amongst other things, focal length determines how much you can see through your lens and how magnified the image you're looking at is. Now, when you start talking about a 17mm lens or a 35mm lens or an 85mm lens, some people think that's the actual physical measurement of the lens itself. And while it does influence lens design, that isn't accurate. You could have an 85mm lens that was actually longer than 85mm. For example, this is a 50mm Sony lens and it's longer than 50mm. A lot of times lenses with higher focal lengths are called long lenses because they do tend to be longer. Funny enough, not many people refer to shorter focal lengths as short lenses, just long lenses. Anyways, to make recognizing focal length easy, if you look at almost any lens, it's going to give you the focal length on the lens somewhere. For example, this is a 100mm lens and it gives the length right there. And there are other type of lenses that have numerous focal lengths on them, and they actually have one focal length at one end and another focal length at the other end. There's other types as well where you can see you have the focal length here, and because there's a lot of focal lengths built into this lens, you can switch from one to the other. But these numbers are your focal length. But you know what? How focal length gets measured isn't really what's important. So unless you're an optical designer, don't spend too much time worrying about it. So what is important about focal length? Well, how much you can see through the lens and how you actually see it. Well, what is angle of view or field of view? In broad terms, the lower the focal length, for example, 14mm, 25mm, or 35mm, the more of the scene in front of the camera the lens will capture. The higher the focal length, such as 85mm, 100mm, or 200mm, the less of the scene in front of the camera is being captured. This is called angle of view or field of view. Now, angle of view is simply how much of the scene being photographed the lens can take in from side to side. It is measured from the center of the lens going out. Have a look at this graphic, it should make it clear. Where you just see from the center of the lens going out is a wider and wider angle of view. So the shorter the focal length, the lower number, the wider the angle of view and the more the lens can see of the overall scene. Lower focal length lenses, usually 35mm and below, are called wide angle lenses because of the wide angle of view. Now have a look here as I take a photograph of the Griffith Observatory towards downtown Los Angeles. Now, all I really want you to see here as I'm taking these photos is what's happening as I increase the focal length. Because remember, pushing in closer and closer, but we're going to be seeing less and less. Like here's 28mm, 35, 50mm, we're getting closer, 70mm, the buildings are getting larger in the frame, and we're seeing less and less of the hill that was on the right, and now we're really just seeing the buildings. All right, so let's do another example. Have a look at this shot of our model being filmed with a wide-angle lens around 24mm to start. Now pay attention to what is happening as I continue to increase the focal length of the lens. The longer the focal length, the higher the number, the narrower the field of view, and less of the overall scene it can see. So have a look at the scene being shot at 24mm, now 50mm, now 70, let's look at 100, now let's look at 135, and finally 200. So I'm not moving the camera at all. I'm only changing the focal length of the lens on the camera. So I've kind of created a little bit of a guide photo here just so you can see sort of how much of the scene you can see as you change the focal length. This is just to give you an approximation of what it would be like and what you would see in the same scene with different focal lengths. And there's some really good tools for this online, by the way. They have focal length calculators and stuff like that. So earlier in the video on shutter speed, I mentioned that there's a formula for calculating how fast your shutter speed should be when you're hand holding your camera so you don't get camera shake. I didn't want to go over it so you understood what focal length was. So roughly the rule of thumb is this. If you're hand holding your camera, your shutter speed shouldn't be lower than the focal length of your lens. For example, if you're shooting on a 50mm lens, you shouldn't drop your shutter speed below 1/50th of a second. Now if you're using a 100mm lens, you wouldn't want to have a shutter speed lower than 1/100th of a second. Now, image stabilizers inside your lenses or cameras can help you get even lower shutter speeds. But if you have a mission critical shot where everything must be perfectly crisp, use a high shutter speed or stick the camera on a tripod. Okay, so in terms of practicing on your focal lengths at home, I really don't have any idea what your lens situation is. I don't know if you have one lens or several lenses or one lens with several focal lengths in it. But hopefully you have at least a few lenses to play with or at least a few focal lengths to see what I'm going to talk about here. So what I want you to do is I want you to put your camera in the aperture priority mode. And then I want you to go ahead and set your aperture for the lowest aperture that your lenses can do. For example, this is a 16 to 35 millimeter. The lowest aperture is f4. So I'm going to shoot this flower here at f4. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move it up to 35. Okay, it's still at f4. Now I'm going to go ahead and change the lens. I'm now putting a 50 on here, and I just want to go ahead and set this to f4 as well. Taking another photo. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to change the lens one more time. So I've done 16, 35. So now I'm going to put on a 100 millimeter lens. And again, I'm going to make sure that my aperture is set to f4 so that it's consistent. I'm going to take off the lens cap too. Okay. I'll put these photos up on the screen so that you can see them. But even if you're doing this at home, as you're changing focal lengths, there's two things that should be really obvious to you by now as you increase focal length. One, the magnification is increasing. Because we're moving closer and closer to the main subject, it's filling more of the screen. And two, we're gradually seeing less of the overall scene because the field of view is narrowing as the focal length increases. Now, changing focal length isn't changing exposure at all, but it is changing something else. Can you see what it is in looking at these photos? As we change focal length, it's changing how much is in focus, because changing focal length also affects your depth of field. So let's talk about composition. You've gotten a decent introduction to cameras and lenses. You've learned a lot about controlling exposure, motion blur, and sharpness. All concepts which deal with settings on your camera and lens, and how you use those to achieve artistic control. But there's still another huge factor related to all of this and capturing great images with your camera. Simply stated, how do you position the camera and your subject for maximum impact? Now, have you ever looked at a photo and just gone, wow? Now, maybe there were some things you recognize like motion blur, exposure, or depth of field, but there was still something that you couldn't really put your finger on as to why it worked. You just knew you wanted to be able to take photos like that. A lot of that reaction you had probably had to do with how the shot was composed. So, what is composition? Well, I think there's a lot of opinions out there as to what composition means exactly. But from my own experience and my own words, here's how I say it. Composition is the practice of arranging objects and spaces in your frame to help communicate the message or story of your photograph. Maybe you want a shot that communicates balance and order, so you compose it that way. Or perhaps you want something more chaotic or frenetic, so you arrange the scene that way as well. There are many tools to help you achieve striking, dynamic, balanced or imbalanced compositions. But it all starts with knowing what you're trying to say, so that you can then use various tools of composition to say it better. In this course, I want to introduce you to two of the most basic tools many photographers use to help them compose their photos. There are many others, but these two will get you started and moving in the right direction. What are leading lines? Leading lines are strong lines in nature or man-made structures which you can use to compose the photo so that the viewer's eye is attracted to a specific part of the frame. Sometimes a leading line is used to direct them towards the principal subject, and sometimes they are used as the primary compositional element themselves. Whenever you set up to shoot a scene, you should look around to see what leading lines you can use to help you compositionally to tell your message. Let me try and shoot our model here using the lines of the bridge leading up to her. Do you think that leading lines made a better image here? When you go out and take photos, try and find strong lines that help lead the viewer to the center of the photo. Look for paths, roads, rivers, walls, rock formations, anything that can be used to direct the viewer's eye to where you want them to be looking in the image. So what is the rule of thirds? Well, the rule of thirds is sort of a guideline in photography and composition of dividing your image into equal proportions of thirds vertically and horizontally, and placing subjects of primary photographic interest on the intersections of these lines, and or the main lines in the frame upon the horizontal or vertical lines. It sounds really complicated, but it's really not. Many beginning photographers frame their shots with the horizon line in the center of the frame, and this kind of makes the photo look almost mirrored or split in half. But if you try adjusting your frame to get the strongest lines on the horizontal and include a foreground object at the intersection, you can get a more powerful result. Let's try a couple of examples here. So I'm going to take a photo of this bridge here, and I'm going to position it here with this kind of in the foreground. The rule of thirds isn't religious dogma. It's a guiding principle to help you obtain more powerful, more pleasing compositions. Most cameras these days will actually allow you to pull up grids, including a rule of thirds grid, to help you sort of frame your subjects. And it's a good guideline to start. I suggest you use this grid as a tool until you're familiar enough with the rule of thirds that you can visualize it in your mind easily as you're looking at your photos. So composition isn't as complicated as some people make it out to be. More than anything, it involves a lot of walking and moving the camera and your subject around to find just the right composition and framing it to make it work. The key that you need to realize is that creativity takes experimentation and trying new things. Don't just walk up to something and take a photo and go, wow, that was it, and walk away. Shoot it until you know you've got the best shot. Try every angle. Try every exposure. The more you do this, the faster it will get, because you won't have to waste your time on things you know don't work anymore. You're going to build up a library of things that you go, oh, this worked, this didn't work, and then you can go through them and try more things faster. Now, it's also worth mentioning that you can do a lot with your photo in your editing programs such as Lightroom or Photoshop to adjust your image and achieve different compositions just by taking the top off or the sides off and moving it around in the frame. All right. I know there is a ton more to know about composition in photography, but just use what I've taught you here to start to develop your mind's eye for looking for different ways to compose your images and tell stories. The more you play around with this, the more you walk around and try different things at every location or every photo you do, the faster you will get at mastering composition. And from there, you can add more and more tools of composition to take amazing photos. All right, so before you dive into the final part of this course, which is really going to be a lot of technical and software related information, I wanted to do one final short video to give you an easy to remember mental checklist you can use before shooting to remember everything you've already learned on the course. I call it SAFETY. It's a bit of a lame acronym, but it works. Shutter, aperture, focus, exposure, temperature, yay. I know the yay is not really complicated. It basically just means yeah or woo. You've composed the shot and it's awesome. So someone else does need to come up with a better use of the letter Y at the end, but for now, it works. So getting familiar with your camera so it becomes second nature takes a fair amount of work. But even when you've been using your camera for years and it all seems like second nature, it's easy to get lost or forget something in the stress of a tough shoot schedule or whatever might be happening. And obviously you're already looking at the image you're going to take to ensure that it pleases you. But before you press the shutter release or the record button, just remember SAFETY. It will just give you a chance to check that you have the right shutter speed, that you've set the correct aperture, that your focus is correct, that your exposure is good, that you have the right color temperature, and that you're happy with the image that you're about to capture. With those 6 things checked off, you can concentrate on what is in front of the camera that you are capturing until you say, yay, I love it. Again, please, if you think of a better way to use the letter Y at the end, let me know. So let's talk a little bit about how lenses distort reality. Now, this is a subject that could go really deep, but I just want to touch on it briefly so that you understand that changing focal length can change the apparent size of objects and spaces, and it can also change the perceived distance between objects and a photo. One of the most powerful tools you have as a photographer is the distortion of how the human eye perceives reality. It's part of what makes photography so fascinating. You can show people things they have seen many times in ways they've never seen it before. Even something as simple as a flower. When you take really close shots, you're making people look at something in a new way. So now I want to show you some obvious and some of the less obvious aspects of changing focal length on your lenses and how the optical distortions can be used to creative effect. Now, lenses actually do pretty amazing things with light. It isn't just a capture of what's there. Lenses actually distort light, which can make something look very different than how it might seem to our eyes. Actually, the vast majority of work that goes into designing lenses that are useful is getting rid of unwanted distortions and aberrations from the image. But that doesn't mean they're all gone. So let's look at some obvious examples of distortion that you're probably pretty used to seeing in photography. Because I'm trying to keep this simple and straightforward, I'm not going to try and explain to you why the various distortions occur. I just want you to be aware that they do occur. So here's an obvious example that you're probably used to seeing, which is when buildings have unnatural curvature when you tilt your camera up. This is most obvious when you're using wide-angle lenses and you tip your camera so that the lens isn't parallel to your vertical lines. I mean, we know these buildings are straight, right? Yet the lens makes them appear to be falling away from us. And with wide-angle lenses, as you get closer to the edge of the lens, you can see that more and more extreme distortion occurs. You can do a lot in photo editing software to correct these type of distortions, but there are also specialty lenses that eliminate these distortions so that your lines stay straight. And if you're going to be doing architecture as your primary photographic subject, you might want to think about these. We'll touch upon these later when we talk about lenses and different specialty lenses. But just remember that in photography, you might not want to always have straight lines. Photographing with wide-angle lenses can definitely offer some interesting views of things. Again, don't worry about why these type of lenses do this for right now. Just focus on what they do. As an example, let's have a look at how you can use them to get interesting effects on objects, like cars. With a wide-angle lens, getting at the corner of a car can show it in a very different and unique way. It can be really fun to play around with these. Okay, so you can see how really wide-angle lenses can distort the images at the edges, or when you're photographing something and not shooting it straight on. That's a really obvious example of how this works and what I'm talking about lens distortions. Now I want to show you a less obvious example of how you can use this to your advantage when you're taking photographs. Now when you start in photography, you might notice that longer focal length lenses will make things appear to be closer together, while shorter focal lengths will make them look further apart. Now, if you've ever looked at photos of a place that you wanted to rent or buy, and it makes the place look huge, and then you walk in there and you're like, wait, what? It's suddenly like this tiny space. This is an interesting thing that wide-angle lenses can do, which is to make spaces appear to be bigger. So I'm going to put a 16mm lens on here, and it's actually a 16mm to 35mm, and I'm going to show you a few different shots of this location. And I'm just going to kind of move around this room here and just take shots at 16 and go into 35. So I just want you to see that this is how a lens can appear to make a space bigger and make things look further away. Watch as I cycle through 16mm, 20mm, 25mm, and 35mm, and just look at how the space gets smaller because the angle of view is shrinking. This is how a lens can appear to make a space look bigger and make things look further away. But lenses can also do the opposite. Let's take a look. So another interesting aspect of lens distortion, which is common with longer lenses, let's say 85mm and up, is that they can make things look closer together. This is usually referred to as lens compression. So I'm going to take some more photos here of my model. I'm going to keep my aperture at f2.8 and the ISO and shutter speed the same, but I am going to change my focal distance to try and keep her the same size as I'm changing the focal lengths. So what I want you to pay attention to is watch the pure columns behind her as we take each photo. So here she is at 24mm, 35, 50, 70, 100, and 200. Look at what is happening with the features of her face, but more importantly, look at how the background is changing. It's appearing to pull the objects closer to the model and make them bigger as the focal length increases. This is what's called lens compression. Interesting, right? So I want to show you this effect of lens compression again in another location. Pay attention to the size of the background and how close it appears to be to her, and also pay attention to how the longer lenses are more flattering to our model's features, which I'll talk about more in another video. Okay, so now we're going to take a shot of the model in front of the bridge. The model is going to be the same size in the frame, but the focal length is going to change. We're going to go from 24 to 35, 50, 70, 85, 100, 135, 200. Again, this particular type of distortion is called lens compression, as it is compressing the space between the foreground and the background, making them appear to be closer than they actually are as you increase the focal length of your lens. I know it sounds a little tricky, but just know longer lens makes things look squishier together. Okay, so I think you get the basic idea that different lenses can create different visual looks that aren't what we see with our eyes. Let's quickly summarize what we've discussed so far about lenses. 1. A lens works by capturing light to bring it into the camera. The amount of light that is let in is controlled by the aperture of the camera, which also happens to influence depth of field. 2. To determine which part of the image is sharp, you have to focus the lens on a particular point in front of the camera. This point where focus is set to is referred to as focal distance. 3. Changing focal distance affects depth of field. The closer the object being focused on is to the camera, the more the background behind it will be out of focus. And the further away it is, the more the background behind it will be in focus. 4. Lenses are measured by their focal length. Longer focal lengths mean we see less of what is in front of the camera because the angle of view or field of view is narrowing. And shorter focal lengths show more of what is in front of the camera because the angle and field of view is going wider and are referred to as wide-angle lenses. Changing focal length also influences depth of field. Finally, using lenses with longer focal lengths will appear to move objects closer together from the foreground and background, and using wide-angle focal lengths can make spaces appear to be bigger or appear to push things further away. ISO, shutter speed, and aperture make up the exposure triangle. Object speed, shutter speed, and camera movement make up what I call the motion blur triangle. And aperture, focal distance, and focal length make up what I call the depth of field triangle. Now, pretty much every photographer is going to have heard of the exposure triangle, but don't mention those other two, the shutter speed triangle or the motion blur triangle, to them because I think I probably just invented it. The important thing is this. The combination of those things give you an infinite amount of creative choices you can make to create excellent photographs. And you should spend some time practicing each of those with your handy dandy flowers or whatever else you choose, because there's going to be a point where it all clicks and you go, aha, I get it. But that takes practice, practice, practice. All right, we're not done talking about lenses yet. Let's talk about how you talk about lenses. All right, so what is motion blur? Let's keep it simple here to start. Motion means movement, right? Blur means a streak or a smear or something that is indistinct or not sharp. So motion blur is the streaking or smearing you see in a photograph that is caused by the object being photographed moving while the shutter is open and the picture is being taken. Here are a couple examples. Now, motion blur, or the lack of it, is a creative choice photographers can use to help communicate speed or movement in your image. It is regulated by shutter speed. Now let's back up the truck for a second. We often think of a photograph as a single moment in time. But how fast or how long is a moment? Well, that's what you decide with shutter speed. Some photographs take 1/1000th of a second. That's a pretty short moment. But if you're photographing something like a hummingbird, you would want it frozen, and you need a super fast shutter speed for that, right? So that's a fast moment. But some photographs could be a half a second, or a second, or 30 seconds, or even longer to capture a single moment. It really just depends on what you're trying to show or what you're trying to capture in the photograph and how long you want the moment to be that is portrayed in the image. Whether those stars at night, waves crashing on a beach, anything that's moving in the frame while the shutter is open is going to show up with a certain amount of blur. Now let's go ahead and see how this works in the real world. Okay, so now we're going to take some photographs here, both with and without a tripod. So don't really pay attention to exposure on this. I want you to examine them for two things. One is the amount of motion blur of the model in the photograph, and two is the overall sharpness of the image. Now I'm going to adjust my camera to compensate for changes in shutter speed to try and keep the exposure in the ballpark, but what I really want you paying attention to is just how blurry things are. So in the first picture, I'm at about 1/1000th of a second. Everything is amazingly sharp in the photo, including the waves in the background. In picture 2, we're going to have a shutter speed of about 1/500th of a second. Everything is still very, very sharp. There's no motion blur. In picture 3, we have a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second. Still pretty sharp. In picture 4, we're now getting down to 1/50th of a second. And now you're starting to see some blurriness, right? It's definitely not as sharp as the earlier images. So now we're at 1/25th of a second, and now you're really starting to see the problem here. Now as we go down to 1/12th and lower, you can forget about it. Aside from how the model looks, there's just way too much camera shake. But now I want you to look at this if I take the photo at 1/12th of a second using a tripod. Do you see that the overall image is sharp, but the subject of the photograph is blurred out? So when you eliminate camera shake at low shutter speeds with a tripod, what you're left with is the blur on objects moving in the frame. So just as a quick note, at very slow shutter speeds or where sharpness is critical and you don't want any camera movement at all, photographers will use a little remote trigger that just has a cable to the camera or wirelessly that they can activate it so that not even by pressing the button, they're causing camera shake. And as you probably know, on most new cameras, you can even just do that right from your smartphone. So camera shake as a technical error is definitely something you want to pay attention to and make sure isn't there. So do you see how changing shutter speed not only changes the amount of light you are letting hit the sensor, it also affects the motion blur you see on objects you are photographing. So now I want you to practice this with your camera on a tripod, or set your camera on top of a book or something so that it is still. Make sure that you've got the camera once again set on shutter priority mode. Get your motion object in motion, and then take a photo at 1/1000th of a second, then drop it to 1/500th, then 1/250th, then 1/125th, then 1/60th, 1/30th, 1/15th, 1/6th, and then 1 second. All I want you to see is that you are controlling the amount of motion blur in your image through shutter speed, and that different speeds have different amounts of blur. When you see cool photos of people waving sparklers or glow sticks and they are nice and streaky, it is shutter speed that is being used to get those streaks. Well, if there are a bunch of shutter speeds that work to get a proper exposure and different amounts of blur, how do you figure out what shutter speeds to use? So you may have noticed that anytime you're thinking of buying a lens or you put it in your shopping cart, that you'll get a little pop-up saying, hey, buy this lens filter to protect the front of the lens from dust and dirt. Well, that is a type of lens filter, but there's a whole world of filters out there, and there are actually now a lot of software filters that try to emulate these. Now, filters is a really big subject. We could cover it for an hour by itself. But really, I only wanted to touch upon one crucial aspect of filters that you need to understand, because it has to do with exposure. Now, this is something that you're going to run into a lot if you shoot video or you shoot long exposure photos. So here's the setup. You decide you want a photo where basically your creative decisions leave you with an image that you can't get properly exposed with shutter speed, ISO, and aperture alone. And again, these are usually long exposure photographs where you have to leave the shutter open for a long time. Most often, I would say this happens with landscape photography, where people like to have really blurry clouds in the sky or smooth water, which sometimes requires an exposure around 20 to 30 seconds. And even with an aperture at f8 or f16 and the ISO at 100 or lower, it can still be too bright to be considered a good exposure. It's going to be overexposed or blown out, as people like to say. So what do? Well, you either have to change your artistic decision related to the shot, or you need something to cut the amount of light hitting your sensor. And this is where filters come in. The most common ones for reducing light without changing the color are called ND filters, or neutral density filters, which basically means these don't mess with your color, but just make it darker. You do have to be careful, because cheap ND filters can put a weird green cast or something on your image, so just make sure you buy good filters. There's no reason to have a really cheap filter on an expensive lens, right? And as you can see here, this is an ND filter that I use a lot for video work, and when I rotate it, it gets gradually darker. Now this is a neutral density variable filter because it's going from lighter to darker, varying. You can get ND filters in various degrees of darkness to block specific amounts of light, or you can also get adjustable ND filters, they're called variable NDs, which you can use for a wide range of exposure situations and get darker or lighter just by turning the filter clockwise or counterclockwise. These are convenient, but they tend to be more expensive, and they can introduce unwanted color effects or color changes if you go too much on them. Most of these variable NDs will just screw right onto the front of your lens. Let's see how this works in practicality. So we're going to do a long exposure shot here with the waves crashing up against the rocks, and we'll do it with and without NDs just so you can see what it looks like. So first, let's see what it looks like without long exposure and no ND filter needed. Very crisp waves, all that. Then we're going to do it without an ND filter so you can see how overexposed it is, and then finally we'll shoot it with an ND filter. I just want you to see the different settings and why you need this as opposed to why you might not need this. There are literally hundreds of different types of filters out there which change colors, darken specific parts of your image, create special effects, and so on. I'm not going to cover any of that in this course. I just want to make sure that you know that it exists. So as you progress as a photographer, it's something you can explore to have greater creative control over your images. All right, let's talk about dynamic range. Now, you just heard me talk a little bit insulty about megapixel obsession, but what you won't hear me say is the same thing about dynamic range obsession. And while I don't think it's the most important factor in image quality, I definitely rank it near the top of the list. So, what is dynamic range? When you hear people talking about dynamic range, they are referring to how much light information a camera can capture with one exposure. Specifically, how much information will be there between the darkest point and the brightest point in the image. Because after those points, there's no detail to be captured. The range they're talking about is the difference between the brightest point in the image and the darkest point in the image. And outside of that, there will be no information because the sensor just can't capture anymore. For example, have you ever been driving into a tunnel in bright daylight and you have a hard time seeing detail in that tunnel? And then when you drive through the tunnel, you have a hard time seeing out into the daylight again? Well, that's because your eye has a dynamic range as well, just like a camera. So how do you measure dynamic range? Well, dynamic range is measured in stops, just like aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And if you look at the chart, you can see that the human eye is estimated to have about 20 stops, depending on lighting conditions. Film at its best was about 13 to 14 stops, maybe a little higher. But the new digital cameras that are coming out these days range between 14 and 17 stops of dynamic range and are rapidly getting better. Now, you could really get complicated about all this if you want. I'm really happy with the difference between the brightest point and darkest point a camera can see in a single exposure. That makes sense to me. I get it. It's basically how bright and how dark can the image be in one shot. So how does this work in practicality for photographers and in examining image quality? Well, the more dynamic range your camera has, the more light information you can capture in an image. Now, if you've ever shot inside a house and all the windows are pure white because it exceeds the camera's dynamic range, well, you might want a camera that can capture at least some of the detail of what's outside. Even in a location like this, I'm standing in the shade to try and sort of get something where you can see my face and you can see some of the background without it being completely blown out. And it's tough, but because of the camera I'm shooting with has such high dynamic range, I know I can get away with it. Whereas this camera, which has less dynamic range, is struggling more with that. So what is high dynamic range photography? Well, if you are shooting a bright sunset, you want to be able to see some detail in the sun and some detail in the shadows of what you're photographing. A lot of times when you have really harsh sun and really harsh shadows, you don't see both. So now when I'm photographing here, I've got the model over here and these rocks that are backlit by the sun very heavily, but we can still make out some details, but this could be a lot better if I had a flash or if we use something to bounce light onto her, but that's not always possible. And that's why many photographers like to take 2 or 3 photos with different exposures and combine them to make one photo with greater dynamic range. Now, this photography is called high dynamic range, or HDR photography. It's used a lot in landscape and architectural type photography, and some people also use it for portraits to get very interesting effects on the skin. Now, you may be familiar with this because actually most smartphones have HDR built in. You take it up and it's got a little HDR that flashes on and you select it. It takes a photo of the brighter areas, then the darker areas, and then it combines them to make an image which has more exposure or more image information by using it from both photos. So just remember that dynamic range is basically just how many stops of light you can get from your sensor from the brightest bright and the darkest dark in your image. And I think as sensors get better, that in a few short years, you're going to find that most cameras will have sensors that exceed the dynamic range of the human eye. In the meantime, know that a camera with a better dynamic range is always a good thing. And you can always use HDR photography or high dynamic range photography to help you capture more detail than your sensor is natively capable of. All right, so what are f-stops? Well, photographers don't just say they want their aperture darker or brighter. Professionals know and use numbers which refer to how open or how closed the aperture in their lens is. These numbers are called f-numbers or f-stops. Over time, photographers and manufacturers agreed that the openings in the lens should stop at a particular f-number to achieve consistent results from lens to lens, with an exact amount of light being let in at those numbers. And these are, you guessed it, what are now known as f-stops. You can see these marked on the sides of manual camera lenses. Not much so on automatic camera lenses. So f-stops are written either with a plain F and a slash, or with a stylized F and italics, or as a hooked F. Now it's going to get a little tricky, but bear with me, okay? To fully explain f-stops, I'd have to get into some complicated math having to do with lenses and diameters and blah, 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 blah. But guess what? I'm not going to. As a famous philosopher once said, keep it simple, stupid. So, let's revisit shutter speed for one moment. All right, so let me ask you a refresher question really quick. Do you have more light with 1/500th of a second or more light with 1/250th of a second? That's right, obviously 1/250th of a second because we're talking about fractions. Well, for aperture, I want you to think of the F in f-stops as standing for fractional. You know what a fraction is, right? It's a part of something. If you can answer this next question correctly, you'll be able to understand f-stops. What is more, 1/4 of something or 1/2 of something? Tick, tock, tick, tock. That's right, 1/2. But the 2 is a smaller number, yet we know it means a bigger amount because it's a fraction, right? It's the same with f-stops because f-stops represent fractional increases in the hole size in your lens. So an f-stop of f2.8 is a bigger hole size than an f-stop of f5.6. So let's take one photo at f2.8 and one photo at f5.6. You can obviously see that the photo at f5.6 is darker. So let's do this. Okay, so this is going to be shot here at f5.6. Okay, and let me see that real quick. Open your parasol, and do you want to try it over your other shoulder, your left shoulder? There you go. Okay, and now I'm going to show you with f2.8. Cool. Okay, so this is again at f2.8. Go ahead and look straight ahead. Okay, and now I'm going to close it down to 5.6. Okay, and you can see that's too dark. Okay, I'm going to try one more here. Gonna get even further away. Good. And going back down to f2.8. Okay. Okay, now just look at me slightly and give me a little bit of a smile. Good. Now look over that way. Okay, now look up. Okay. Nice. So just remember that the lower the number means a bigger opening, which means more light is let into the camera through your lens. The higher the number means a smaller opening and less light is let in. All right, so somewhere on your lens is usually written what the lowest f-stop of that lens is. For example, on this lens, it is f4, which you can see up here. When someone says to open up the aperture, they mean to go from a higher f-stop to a lower f-stop, effectively making the hole letting in the light more open. So I'm going to take my camera, and now I'm going to go from a shot that is at f8, and then I'm going to open it down to f5.6. I've let in more light, and therefore the photo is brighter. So when I've opened the aperture from f8 to f5.6, the hole is open more, and the photo is therefore brighter. Now when you hear a photographer saying they are shooting wide open, it means they are at the lowest f-stop that the lens is capable of. And as a side note, the lower the f-stop of the lens, the more expensive it usually is. You can find a used 50mm 1.4 lens for a couple $100 or even under $100, but a 1.2 lens will set you back by about $2,000. Now just like ISO has some common numbers to indicate the doubling or halving of light, and shutter speed has some common numbers to indicate the doubling or halving of light, aperture also has some common numbers to help you understand when you are doubling or cutting your light in half. The f-stops which indicate doubling and halving are f64, f45, f32, 22, 16, 11, 8, 5.6, 4, 2.8, 2, 1.4, and 1. Now one thing that confuses a lot of people is that at first you might think that from f4 to f8 you have twice as much light. That's not true though. You actually have 4 times as much light. From f5.6 to f4 you have twice as much light. Each of these numbers represents double the amount of light. For some people this can be really confusing, but you know what? It's not important right now because you probably have a camera with a digital back, so you can see that when you open and close your aperture, it's getting brighter or darker, and you can instantly see the exposure you want. In a later video, I'll cover this more. For now, I want you to shake your head and just understand that for aperture, the higher the number, the less light you let into your camera. The lower the number, the more light you let in. f16 has a lot less light than f2.8. Okay, So to help you wrap your head around all of this, what I want you to do is I want you to go ahead and put your camera back in manual mode. Go ahead and set your aperture somewhere to around f16 and get your ISO and shutter speed so that at f16 you have an image that's at a decent exposure. Even if it's a little dark, not terrible. Then what I want you to do is just go ahead and start dropping it down through different apertures. Like this would be f11. Now I'm going down to f8. Now I'm going down to 5.6. More and more light is getting let into the camera, and it's getting more and more blown out. Now, everything that we've talked about so far in aperture has been related to exposure, but there is another major factor in photography that aperture controls. So let's go over that. Do you remember how ISO controlled exposure but also affected noise levels? That the lower ISO number was less light and also less noise, and that the higher ISO number was more light but more noise? And remember how shutter speed also controlled exposure but it affected motion blur? Higher shutter speeds mean less light and less blur. Lower shutter speeds give us more light but also more blur. Okay, so now I'm going to take another series of photos here in front of the bridge with our model, and I'm going to adjust the ISO and shutter speed to keep the photo properly exposed while adjusting the aperture. Now what I want you to watch is what is happening in the background of the image behind her. So if you look at the series of the photos with the model, that as we're opening up the aperture, the background behind her is getting blurrier and blurrier. This is one thing that happens when you open up your aperture. Okay, so now I want you to go ahead and try this for yourself. Go ahead and take your camera, and on the mode dial, I want you to find A or AV. The AV stands for aperture value, and this is basically just an aperture priority mode, where the camera will change the ISO and the shutter speed depending on what your aperture is to keep the exposure balanced and more or less correct. So what I want you to do is go ahead and just start taking photos of your flowers at the highest f-stop that it will do. This does f22, and then just go ahead and drop it down, continuing to just change your aperture. But I really want you paying attention to what's happening in the background of these images, because you'll see that the background is getting more and more out of focus. So just go ahead and put the camera on the highest f-stop that your lens will do, and then gradually open it up to the lowest f-stop. But pay particular attention to the background, because as you're lowering the aperture number, the background is going to become more and more blurry. And this is because aperture not only affects the light that's coming in the camera for exposure, it heavily influences what is in focus in the image. So when you've sort of got a feel for what that looks like, let's go to the next video and let's talk about it. So I'm not going to get into the complicated mathematics and optics to explain to you why these things work the way they do. You can look that up online if you want to. I just want to give you an understanding of how they work so that you can use them. So by now you should understand that aperture controls the amount of light that is let into the camera, which affects the exposure of your photo. You should also get by now that aperture is measured using f-stops. The lower the f-stop, the more light that is let into the camera. The higher the f-stop, the less light that is let into the camera. So this is a photo at a higher aperture, somewhere around f8, and this is a photo somewhere around f4. But changing your aperture doesn't just affect how much light is let into the camera. It affects how much is in focus in your image, which is to say, aperture size affects depth of field. How? In broad terms, the lower your f-stop, the shallower your depth of field will be. The higher your f-stop, the deeper your depth of field will be. Now let's take a photo here with her, and let's pay attention to what is happening into the background of the image as I change the f-stop. I'm going to be adjusting the ISO and the shutter speed to keep the exposure correct while I change my aperture. So let's see what happens. Okay, where are we here? That looks really nice when you're looking off like just like that. A little bit more kind of like, there you go. So this is at f22. I'm going to back up just a little bit more here. So this is at f22, and everything behind her is in focus. So now we're going to go ahead, and we're going to drop this down to f11. Okay. This is f8. Okay. Do the head in the hand and just looking out that way. Okay. Nice. Now we're going to drop down to f5.6. Okay. Good. Now look up, kind of up that way. There you go. I'm going to drop this all the way down to f2.8. Nice. That's really, really pretty. That pose there was very, very pretty. Okay. Higher aperture number, deeper focus, deeper depth of field. Let's look at an example at night on a bit of a closer shot and where you can see what happens to the points of light in the background. So I'll start at the top of this lens at an aperture of around f32 or f22, and I'm going to work my way down to its maximum aperture at 1.4. Do you see how much less is in focus as you open up the aperture? Do you see what's happening to the lights as they go more and more out of focus? Now look, it takes a lot of practice to get really skilled at using aperture correctly. But it is critical if you want to be a professional that you really understand it and know how to use depth of field to your advantage. You'll also notice that lenses with f2.8 and lower f-stops are usually far more expensive than those with f-stops starting at f4 or higher. It's a pretty good rule of thumb that the wider the aperture on a lens, the more expensive it is relative to its own class of lens. For example, this is a 50mm 1.4, and I think I got this used for about $300, $400. But the 50mm 1.2, I think, is almost $1,500, and it's only 0.2 difference. So just realize when you're looking for lenses, the wider the aperture, the more expensive it's likely to be. All right, so now I want you to go ahead and practice adjusting your aperture to increase or decrease depth of field. So set your camera to aperture value, or A for aperture priority mode, and start taking photos of your flowers or whatever other object you have around, and just go ahead and adjust your lens till it's at the highest f-stop that it will take, and then gradually open it more and more and more, and watch as the depth of field decreases and your background goes more and more out of focus. I'm going to go ahead and close the aperture down to f22, which is as closed as this lens will go. And then I'm just going to start taking photos of my flowers. And I'm going to observe that the background is very in focus. I'm going to go down to f11. And I'm going to observe the background is more out of focus. And I'm going to go all the way down to 1.4. Maybe not so much with the sun. And then I'm going to see that the flowers are much sharper while the background is very blurry. All right, so let's recap what we've learned thus far. The ISO, shutter speed, and aperture all work together to control the brightness and darkness of the exposure. ISO also affects the amount of noise in your image. Shutter speed affects the amount of motion blur, and aperture affects the depth of field. Now, there are other things that influence depth of field, but before I go any more into that, I want to bring everything you've learned about exposure together and talk to you about what is called the exposure triangle. Dun, dun, dun. This triangle is made up of ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Let's talk about it. All right, so when you start taking photos, one of the things you have to select in determining image quality is how large the image is going to be. File storage is getting so cheap that you could probably just leave it on the highest setting on your camera and be totally happy. But I want to ensure you understand what the options are and what the options mean. So let's talk about this. If you look at any digital image very closely, it is made up of little dots which have a certain brightness value and a certain color value. These digital dots are called pixels. The more pixels a screen or image has, the higher the quality of the resolution. Camera resolution is currently rated in megapixels. What's a megapixel? Well, it's 1 million pixels. A lot of people can get pixel obsessed and worry themselves over technical numbers instead of focusing on how an image looks, and I think that's a mistake. Let's look at something we can relate to easily so you understand why I say this. So you probably know that a full HD TV is 1,920 pixels wide by 1,080 pixel tall. 1920 by 1080 is 2,073,600 pixels, or just over 2 megapixels. Most high-end digital cameras these days are at least 20 megapixels, and even smartphones are now ranging somewhere between 10 and 20 megapixels and climbing. To put that in perspective, if you go watch an IMAX movie with 4K projection, you're looking at 4,096 pixels wide by 2,186 pixels tall, totaling almost 9 megapixels. If you've seen a 5K computer screen, you know how ridiculously sharp those are, and that's only about 15 megapixels. Now, obviously, if you get closer to an image and magnify it, the more you're going to see the individual dots of color. So resolution is important. And for certain specialty scenarios, it's very important to have the highest resolution photos possible. But for most photographers in the world, it isn't something you should be obsessed about unless you plan to really magnify your images and crop certain parts out. So while a lot of manufacturers are pumping out cameras with ever-increasing megapixel counts, one company, Leica, one of the finest camera companies in the history of the world, is content to have their cameras with about 20 megapixels. And I think that's an amazingly bold and smart approach. They just decided this is what you need. And that might not be for every photographer, but I think that's great for 99% of the photographers. Anyways, just know the higher the megapixel, the more the resolution, the sharper the image can be at larger sizes. So really, unless you plan on doing massive size prints or extreme magnification and cropping on your images, you really don't need to obsess about the megapixel count and the resolution of your camera. 20 megapixels is plenty. So now getting back to the point and kind of where this is all leading, that if you open up your camera and go to your image quality menu, which you should have somewhere, you're going to have various different settings that you can put it on. And here, for example, it says RAW, 30 megapixels, and then 6,720 by 4,480. Medium size RAW, if I go down to that, is 17 megapixels. Small RAW, that gets me at 7.5 megapixels. And also I have my camera set so that it's shooting RAW and JPEG at the same time. So down here I have small 3, which is 0.3 megapixels. And I think that's only good for a thumbnail. 2.5 megapixels. 7.5 megapixels. This is 7.5 megapixels with the smooth setting. This is 13 megapixels. This is 13 megapixels with the smooth setting. 30 megapixels. 30 megapixels with the smooth setting. And the smooth setting versus that steppy setting is just how much information that it's capturing in there. Obviously, the smoother it is, the more information, the bigger the file size. Now, if you aren't concerned about running out of space or the cost of storage, go ahead and leave it on large and have a happy day. But if you're tight on space and want to take a lot of photos, you can always lower the megapixel count and know what you're comfortable with. Now, out of all the things that determine image quality in a camera, the one that I pay the least attention to is megapixel count. Now, I know that might sound stupid to some people or a bit of a bold statement, but honestly, any camera you get these days is going to have a ridiculous amount of resolution. And I think what's more important are the things that I'm going to cover in the next 2 videos. So what is focus really? When we talk about focus, we are really talking about sharpness. How sharp things are or how sharp they appear to be in the image that you've captured. And for that matter, which things are sharp and which things are not sharp. You know how to focus, right? It starts with knowing what you're going to take a picture of and how far away it is from you. Then on your lens, there will be a ring that you can turn, and when you turn, you change what appears to be sharp and what appears to be soft in the image. Now, lenses either have feet or inches or metric markings. Sometimes they have both. When you shift the ring, you're changing the distance that you're focusing on. So if my model is standing 10 feet or approximately a little over 3 meters away from me, then I want to make sure that I'm actually focused at that distance on my lens. And I can do that manually here, or I can use the autofocus system on my lens to make sure that she's sharp, because that's what I'm focusing on. Now, many people have a very rigid idea about focus, about what has to be in focus and what isn't, but focus is one of the most flexible and powerful controls in your photographic arsenal. So you can have photos where one tiny thing is all that is sharp or in focus in your photo, and you can have other photographs where everything appears to be super sharp. What is perceived as sharp in your photo is called in focus, and what is perceived as blurry is called out of focus. When you have something in focus, you're generally telling the viewer, this is important. This is what I want you to look at. Now, what you decide to have in focus in your photograph or out of focus depends on what story you are trying to tell. So I'm going to take a photo now with Jessica, showing her in focus with the background out, and then with everything in focus, so you can sort of see how it's a little difficult to see what's important in the frame. Okay, so let's have a look here. Okay, hang on. Okay, hang on. Just getting this framed. Okay, and go ahead and look into the light. Okay, nice. One more, here we go. Look into the light. Okay, so that's everything's in focus. Now I want to show you what happens when I bring this down and I have our model in focus and the background slightly blurred. Nice. Okay, good. And then if you come, like that sight, the sun is a bit harsh on you. Let me just see here. Yeah, get the parasol just to cover up the sun on your face a little bit. Okay, and look up a little higher. Good. One more. Good. Now look out that way. And try putting the parasol over your other shoulder. Yeah, but like switch shoulders. Yeah. Okay. Very nice, very nice, very nice. Okay, good. Now look up at that branch up there. Yeah. Which one of the 5 million branches? All right, cool. You can do anything you want with focus, but there are some general rules regarding it that are good to pay attention to at first. Portrait photos focus on the face or the person, and usually have the background very out of focus. The point of a portrait is the person, and you want to move distractions from the photo. Look if we had the background in focus here. The attention is split between the person and the background, and most portraits should just be focused on the person. Now have a look at it where the background is out of focus. It's a much more interesting portrait, isn't it? Okay, so while I was at the park doing the portraits, and whenever I'm doing a portrait session, I don't just grab one photo. If I'm going to take the work to go to a nice location, I'm going to grab a bunch of different photos. But specifically when I'm photographing people, I definitely like to set it up where I have interesting backgrounds that when they're out of focus, they help sort of like add something to the image, so that even though my eye is focused on the person, there's still something in the background which is interesting for the person to look at, and it sort of adds a nice flavor to it. But my point is that if you're doing portraits, the common rule of thumb is that you want to have the background out of focus and your subject in focus to have a more interesting shot. Now, I'm not trying to teach you a course on portrait photography here, because there's be a bunch of other stuff I would go over, but I'm just trying to, in this section, just sort of give you some examples of some common uses of focus. And in portraits, subject in focus, background out of focus. All right, let's go over architecture and landscape. Now, when photographers are shooting architecture or landscapes, they tend to focus on everything and want to have as much sharp and in focus as possible. Sometimes landscape photographers or architectural photographers will try to find elements at the front of the photo that they can focus on while blurring out everything else just slightly. But again, this is when they are focusing on details of a scene or architectural objects. And these really are just portraits for those details. Now, if you're taking a photo of a detail or something, but everything's in focus, what is the audience supposed to look at? What's important? Focus on a detail, and suddenly the audience understands what is important. And of course, when an architectural or landscape photographer wants to show the vast expanse of something, they will return to having as much as possible in focus, because you are saying everything here is important, or it is the whole of these things which are important. And if you're going to do product photography, just depending on what you're trying to do and how artsy you're trying to be, you can have some parts of the image which are in focus and some part of the image that is out of focus. Now, think about something for a second. Why do we say something is in focus or out of focus? Well, the reason is because while true focus will be an exact point in front of the camera, there is a distance in front of and behind that focus point which will be sharp enough to be considered acceptable. And when we say acceptable, we mean that it's in a range that is acceptable focus, or simply stated, that it's in focus. So now I want to show this to you in a little bit more detail. I'm going to take a tape measure here to make this a little bit clearer. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set this tape measure up here. Hopefully you can see the numbers in some of the photos. Okay, I'm going to take this. So if you look right now, I have the flowers and the moving toy set up at more or less the same distance from the camera. So I'm going to go ahead and take a photo of these two. Okay, and right now, well, let's do it this way so you can see it better. If I have the flowers and this toy at the same distance from the camera, they're both pretty sharp, right? Now watch what happens when I move this toy forward a little bit and I retake this photo. You can see that the toy is now very out of focus. And you can easily see that the toy being behind it is out of focus. But now let's do this a little bit less. Okay, so it's still a little bit behind the flowers. It's much more in focus. It's still a little bit in front of the flowers. It's still kind of sharp. Now, while there's only one exact precise place where it's perfectly sharp, there is a range to the front and the back of that which works. So here's what I want you to understand. Focus is not just an exact point. It is a range where inside of it, things are sharp, and outside of it, things become less sharp. Now that range can be very shallow and narrow, where just the slightest movement will push it out of focus, or it can be very deep, where almost everything you see in the photo is acceptably in focus. So this range we're talking about of what is in focus is called depth of field. This is such a crucial part of photography that I'm going to go over almost everything we've just talked about again as it pertains to depth of field. And one thing that will help you to start thinking with depth of field is if you think of depth of focus. How big of an area, how much from front to back, how deep is that area that's in focus? All right, let's talk about colors. Now, I think that the most important part of any camera when determining image quality is how it captures colors and brightness. And by brightness, I don't mean how bright the image is. I mean how well it captures the subtle differences between what is light and what is dark in the scene. In other words, how well it captures little subtle shades of contrast. Now, the lens on the camera does influence this, but the majority of this comes from the camera itself. And here's how I think you should choose a camera. I think you need to look at the photos that the camera takes, and specifically the photos that you're most likely to take, whether those are landscape, portraits, sports, whatever. Look at the unretouched photos from the camera. And when you find a camera where you go, wow, I love that image, then that's the camera to pick up and get a feel for and see if you'd want to hold it all day, and if you like the ease of use of the system, and if you like it, buy it. Just like the wand chooses the wizard, I think the camera sort of picks the photographer. It will just sort of feel right in your hand, and the colors will just look right to you unretouched. And then with good retouching, they will look even better. So now let's talk about color science and magic. Now, what separates out most camera brands from one another is the color science they use to process the light information they capture. This is their secret sauce to give their cameras their distinctive look. Not much to say about this other than when choosing a camera, pay close attention to the colors and contrast it captures to see what you like the most. My two favorite camera brands for color science are Leica and Canon in the DSLR photography world, and Arri and Canon in the cinematography world. But that's really just my taste. It's not that I dislike Nikon or Sony or any of the others, because I do use them to do shoots. And there are truly spectacular photos from all of those cameras. It's just that however my eyes happen to see color, they are most attracted to the Canon and Leica look. And that's how I want to capture photos. Just like fingerprints, your eyes are kind of unique to yourself. Truthfully though, this isn't as important as it once was because of the amount of ridiculous digital manipulation you can do with any image you capture. But I still believe it's important to see which camera gives you the most pleasing image quality from color standpoint right out of the camera. And part of this, which is also important, is to ensure your camera is set to the right color space for capturing images. What's color space, you say? Well, I'm glad you asked. Color space. So what's a color space, you ask? Well, imagine we called this cup a color space, and instead of liquid, we said that this cup can hold a certain amount of colors. And here's another bigger cup that can hold even more colors. And here's an even bigger cup. And that's really all color spaces are. They're just software that can process more or less colors depending on the color space used. Someone somewhere wants to kill me for oversimplifying this, but don't worry, it's about to get worse. So, as a photographer, the three most common color spaces you're going to hear about are ProPhoto RGB, Adobe RGB, and sRGB. RGB just means red, green, blue, and the S actually doesn't stand for secret, it stands for standard. Now, ProPhoto RGB holds the most colors, Adobe RGB holds the second most colors, and sRGB holds the third most colors. So which one, right? You kind of naturally want to go with the one that holds the most colors because that must be better, right? Well, already, each of these cover spaces already have a ridiculous amount of colors in them. So it's not like you're going from color luxury to color poverty. But here's what I'll tell you. Because most of the world uses the sRGB color space, until you're an experienced photographer who truly understands how to use these other color spaces and knows what they mean, stick with sRGB. Now, on your camera somewhere, you probably have an option to choose the color space between sRGB and Adobe RGB. Stick with sRGB. Most monitors, phones, and digital display devices use sRGB. Most images on the internet are sRGB. So, use sRGB. Your first priority is learning to see the world with a frame around it and obsessing about light and the colors that you see around you. Then learn the exposure triangle until you know it in your sleep. Then learn motion blur and depth of field until you dream about them as well. Then learn lenses until you know them backwards and forwards. And then, when you've taken thousands and thousands of photos and have begun to master your craft and are ready to start doing fine art photography, then go ahead and dive into learning all about ProPhoto RGB and Adobe RGB color spaces. Now, here's what makes this an even easier decision. If you're shooting in the RAW camera format, you can always go back to your old photos and assign a different color space. Only the JPEGs you shoot will have the color space that you chose on your camera baked into them. So really, it's not a big deal for now. For ease of use, keep your JPEGs set to sRGB. Now, I've mentioned the RAW camera format a couple times now. What is it? So, that really brings us to the end of this course. Now, when I set out to make this course, my goal was to create a set of videos where I could teach someone everything I wish I had known 30 years ago when I first started learning photography and getting serious about it. There are still many things that I want to teach you, including how to turn your love of photography into a successful career, if that's something that you want to do. But I can honestly tell you that anything else I could or would teach you, including filmmaking, all builds on the key fundamentals that I've given you in this course related to photography. So learn and practice what I've shown you in this course. I promise that if you do, your photos will improve significantly. And in closing, the most important thing is always to keep looking at the world in search of images worth saving and sharing, and keep taking photos. Don't let a day go by where you don't break out your camera and take a photo of something. I don't care if that camera is your phone or your DSLR or whatever it is. So I hope this course has been helpful and cleared up any confusions you might have on these key subjects of photography. If you feel like I've left something out that should be included with future updates, or if there's another subject you'd like to see me cover, give me a shout out on social media or email me and let me know. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you next time, and I look forward to seeing the beautiful images that you're going to be capturing. All right. So a lot of this course so far has been about the camera and letting a certain amount of light into the camera to hit the camera sensor. This next part of the course is going to be talking a lot about lenses, including 1, how a camera lens works, 2, how lenses are measured and how this changes what you can actually see through the lens, 3, how lenses control depth of field, 4, how lenses distort reality, and 5, the different types of lenses and what they are used for. Now you get what a camera basically is, right? It's a light-proof box that has an opening in it to let light in and a surface or sensor to expose that light to so that it can record an image. So what's a lens? Well, basically it's a device that holds glass to help capture light and bring it into your camera. Making lenses is both a science and an art form, none of which we need to get into. But there is a lot of work and a lot of thought that goes into designing a lens that works excellently. Okay, and I think that by now you get how a lens basically works, right? It lets a certain amount of light in through the front of the lens, and you can control that amount of light through the aperture, either on your camera or through manually controlling the aperture. And then you basically have a ring or autofocus on your camera, which is going to move a piece of glass or pieces of glass forwards and backwards so that there's a point in front of the camera where it's sharp or in focus. Now, we spoke a little bit about focus in an earlier video, but we're going to go much more into this now. Let's examine another aspect of it. When you look at the side of your lens, you're actually going to see that there's numbers here, sometimes feet, sometimes metric, sometimes both. And what these numbers are telling you, or what these numbers are indicating, is the distance in front of your camera that the camera is focused at. Now, this is actually called focal distance, and there's a lot more to know about it. So let's go into it. So what is focal distance? Well, the one-sentence answer is that when you're talking about focal distance, you're talking about the distance from the surface of the sensor inside the camera to the point where the lens is focused in front of it. It's pretty simple, right? Well, it is that simple, but there are a number of layers of complexity in terms of getting optimum focus for different shooting conditions. Now, you already know that changing depth of field changes how much is in focus. So let's talk about how focal distance can change your depth of field. Now, while the results of this will vary depending on the conditions of your eyes, I want you to do a little exercise with me. Go ahead and take one finger, and I want you to bring it as close to your eye as you can and focus on it. Now, without shifting your focus, notice that the background is a lot blurrier. Now, go ahead and move your finger out as far as your arm will let you, and look at the background now. You'll see that there's a lot more in focus behind it, isn't there? It's basically the same with focal distance on a lens. So for all practicality, camera lenses work very similarly to your eye. The closer a focus point is to you, the more the objects behind it would tend to be out of focus. Now watch what happens to our background as our subject moves closer to the camera, but we stay focused on her. We aren't going to change the aperture, it will stay where it is, and we aren't going to change the lenses. The only thing that's changing here is the focal distance, which is again to say, the distance from the camera sensor to the point we are focused on, which in this case is our model. As you can see here, she is further away. It's much more in focus behind her. Now as she's getting closer, much more out of focus. So do you understand that your depth of field can change with focal distance alone? And at a closer focal distance, you can have shallower depth of field? And that a further focal distance can give you a deeper depth of field? Good. But remember that despite focal distance, you can also still influence your depth of field dramatically with your aperture to get deeper or shallower depth of field. Let's take a look. So here she is again, close to the camera. So now let's move our aperture to show that again we are changing depth of field by adjusting the aperture. We can choose an extreme aperture past f22, and that background is still going to be pretty sharp despite the fact she's so close. But if I open it up again to f2.8, the background is going to be much more out of focus with a more pleasant bokeh behind her. All I'm trying to show you is that there are many ways to accomplish the same thing, and that there is a lot of flexibility to achieve the artistic result you want. The depth of field is going to be much deeper, focusing on something 20 feet away than just a few feet away, even at a lower aperture like f2.8, because of the focal distance. This should also tell you that if you want to have a background that's out of focus, the closer the subject you are focusing on is to the camera, and the further away from the background they are, the more out of focus the background's going to be. So if I have my model right against the wall, and even if my aperture is wide open at f1.4, which is pretty intense, but I'm close to her and she's close to the wall, that wall's still going to be pretty in focus. But now if I pull her forward, still keeping her in focus, the background is going to fall more and more out of focus as we go further away from it. This is just a good way to use depth of field to get rid of distracting backgrounds. And it's a really powerful tool because this is one thing that separates what you can do with your DSLR camera and an interchangeable lens than what you can just do on your iPhone. If you don't care if everything's in focus, well, your smartphone will do fine. And even now, they're getting some pretty nifty effects on smartphones which simulate that effect that they're calling portrait mode or something like that. And all they're trying to do is blur out the background so you're focused on the person. And that's how you can do it, by controlling your focal distance. So what does the infinity focus point on a lens mean? Well, if you look at your camera lens, you're going to find that you have an infinity symbol mark, which basically means that when your focal distance passes a certain point, after that it's all in focus forever, which isn't 100% accurate, but that's good enough for now. Basically, it's just saying everything past this point is infinitely in focus. The distance of the infinity point changes from lens to lens, so you're going to have to practice with your own lens, and you'll see that after a certain distance on the focus dial, you'll hit a place where the horizon is best in focus. This is really handy for photographing landscapes, fireworks, or even astrophotography. And you can often find that you have to play just a little bit to find the exact point on the lens where everything goes perfectly in focus, just because it's so fickle that it just might take a little touch to get it just right. There are some other things that you'll learn about focal distance as you advance in photography that can help you find the best focus distances for sharpness and landscape type shots, but that's down the road. Just keep going and you'll get there. For now, just remember, that infinity mark just means everything is in focus from that point forward. All right, so that's focal distance and how focal distance also affects depth of field. Now you know what I want you to do now, right? That's right, it's time to practice with your flowers. So what I want you to do is just practice taking photos of your flowers and changing the distance of your flowers between your camera and where they're at. And pay attention to what's happening with the background and your depth of field. And then when you've got that, I want you to start monkeying around with the f-stops at the same time, seeing how you can change focal distance and then adjust your depth of field using your aperture. All right? So pause and do that. And then once you've got it, come back. Woo! You're fast. Love how fast you did that. All right, so you know how a lens basically works, and you get that a lens's aperture affects depth of field. The lower the f-stop, the shallower the depth of field, and then vice versa. Higher f-stop, the larger the depth of field. And now you should also get that focal distance also affects depth of field. Roughly speaking, the closer a subject you are focusing on is to the camera, the shallower the depth of field, and the more everything behind it will be out of focus. And the farther away you focus, the deeper the depth of field, and the more everything behind your focus point is going to be in focus. This, of course, can be influenced by the aperture, as you have already seen. Okay, so the next important point for you to understand about lenses is how they are measured and how they're called, and how the measurement of the lens not only changes what you can see, but how you see it. We are talking about what is called focal length. Focal what? Don't worry, don't panic. Just go to the next video and we're going to cover and tell you all about what focal length is. Yes, this might sound almost kindergarten simple, but it's essential that you truly understand it. So let me ask you a question. What is the most essential tool of the photographer? Think about it for a second. Then expand this to what you consider the 3 most essential tools of the photographer. Now, most people pursuing photography usually get 2 out of 3 of these right, but not the vital one. 1, your camera with its capture media, obvious, right? 2, your lens, another obvious one. And a lot of people say a tripod or some other piece of kit, but almost everyone overlooks the most crucial tool in their toolkit. It's so unbelievably obvious, but because we take it for granted so often, almost no one gets this one right because they don't understand that it is a tool and one of the most powerful ones you have available. What is it? Light. Starting with the sun, and which we could expand to say a source of light. Photography, after all, means writing with light, doesn't it? No light, nothing to write. More on this in a moment. You actually don't need anything else to capture photographs, and until you know how to use these 3 things well, your camera, your lens, and the light that's available, I wouldn't invest in another single piece of gear except maybe a tripod, but even that isn't absolutely essential, and in many cases will just slow you down while you're trying to learn photography. Alright, so do you agree without these 3 things there is no way to capture an image? Good. So what are they really? Alright, so what is a camera? Well, a camera is basically a light-proof box that has a hole in it that light can come in and a surface where that light is captured and recorded so you get an image. Now, historically, inside cameras, there were chemicals either on a glass surface or later a plastic surface called film, and this would react to the light that came in and it would capture an image. Now, most cameras these days are digital sensors, the vast majority of them. I'm not just talking about DSLRs, I'm talking about smartphones, security cameras, all sorts of other different photographic devices now use digital sensors. There are some purists out there that still use film and even glass plate photography. In this course, we're going to be focusing on cameras with digital sensors. And if you're just starting out in photography, while there might be some sort of attraction to trying film, definitely learn photography on a digital camera because you can instantly see the photos you take, you can learn from your mistakes, and you can dial in your knowledge and understanding of photography, all of which you really need when you start embarking on film photography. All right, so that's what a camera is. Next, let's talk about this little thing that sticks out from the front of it that light comes in on. Now, you know what a lens is, right? It's basically just a device which helps capture, control, and focus light onto the recording surface inside your camera. Now, if you look at a lens, depending on what type of lens you might have one ring which will help you extend the lens, which changes how much you can actually see through it. And then you have a ring which you can use to focus the image. Now, what is focus basically? Well, if you move this ring, you can see that there's numbers here. And those numbers represent a distance in front of the camera. So this focus ring tells you, if you're at 7 in the imperial system, that your focus point is 7 feet in front of the camera. So I want you to go ahead and you can put your camera on automatic mode for now. And if you have on the side of your lens an autofocus or a manual focus setting, go ahead and put it on manual focus just for the fun of it. And then go ahead and look at your flowers and go ahead and focus on them. And then take a photo, and then focus somewhere else. Now we're focusing on the background, and you can see the flowers over in the far side of the frame are more in focus than the flowers here in the front of the frame. Now, all I really want you to see is that the light is coming through the lens and that you're using parts of it to adjust the image. Okay? So that's basically a lens. It's a device for capturing, controlling, and focusing light onto the recording sensor in your camera. Let's go on to the next subject. All right, so as I briefly mentioned earlier, I think most people take light for granted, and that just as crucial to understanding your camera and lens, you must begin to understand and appreciate light. Not in terms of physics or optics formulas, but in terms of visible qualities that you recognize and see wherever you go. Real photographers understand the nuances of light, when it looks best, where to find the best light, and most importantly, how to control it. And this sounds simple, right? But the truth is, as I said, most people take light for granted. I'm not saying you do, but just in case. When was the last time you woke up in the morning and really looked at the light that was filling your room? How about a beautiful sunset? Or when was the last time you looked at the sun kind of going through the trees and what that looked like? How it affected the color of your skin? It's vital that everywhere you go, that you start looking at light and what it does, how it behaves, how it makes you feel. Without light, there is no image. That's obvious, right? The sun is the largest and most freely available source of light. But nowadays, there are plenty of other sources of light around that help us capture images. Street lights, house lamps, security lights, and so on. Sources of light are available everywhere. They all have their distinct characteristics that you can recognize and learn how to use and control to capture the images you want to get. I really do believe that it's critical for you to learn how to use and control natural light first, and only then, when you truly understand it and understand why you would need to add more light, then start exploring artificial lighting techniques or more complex lighting tools to do this. On this course, I won't be showing you any lighting techniques at all. We will be concentrating on the camera and lens and using whatever natural light is available. And the first part of that is just looking around at places that you can shoot to see what does the light look like? What can you get from it? All right, so let's talk a little about controlling the amount of light that gets inside the camera, okay? So all the light that gets inside your camera is controlled by 3 things. One is the sensitivity of the recording surface inside the camera itself. The other one is the size of the hole in your lens that lets light through. And the third one is actually what is called a shutter. And this was a mechanical device that opened and closed to let light in for a certain amount of time. Now, on most new cameras these days, not on most, but on many new cameras these days, there's no physical shutter anymore. It's really just the electronics of the camera turning the sensor on and off, which basically has the same effect. Everything I'm going to be teaching you in this part of the course is going to be about your camera and controlling the light that comes into it through these three things: the sensitivity of the surface, the size of the hole in the lens, and the speed at which the shutter opens and closes in your camera. By learning to control these three things, it's going to give you a major advantage in learning how to capture the images that you have in your mind and be able to tell the stories that you're trying to tell with your camera. So let's get going. All right, ISO, shutter speed, and aperture not only help you control exposure on your image, but control noise, focus, and motion blur. For photographers, these three make up what is commonly called the exposure triangle, because all three of these work together to control exposures and the creative and technical aspects of the photo. Increasing ISO helps brighten the image, but increases noise. A slower shutter speed also adds light, but increases motion blur. And a wider aperture captures more light, but makes for a shallower depth of field. So you've got plenty of ways to get the correct exposure, but you have to remember that you are factoring in creative reasons on the exposure as well. Whenever getting ready to capture a scene, I ask myself these three questions. 1, what is the general light level I already have on my scene, and how do I want it to be? Is it dark at night? Is it bright during the day? Do we need more light for it to artistically appear how I want it to be? And so on. And then once I've settled that, I go, 2, how much motion blur do I want in this scene, and for what? And then 3, what do I want in focus? Does this require a shallow depth of field or a deep depth of field? Answering those questions, I know generally what my settings need to be, but this comes with a lot of practice and a full understanding of these three factors working together. All right, so let's try an exterior landscape. Here's what I know. I want a bright scene with deep depth of field so everything is in focus, and I want the water to have a lot of motion blur so the surface is smooth. So it's daylight, so I'm going to keep my ISO at 100. I'm going to adjust my f-stop and my shutter speed, because what I want is when my image is correctly exposed, I want to get a nice smooth surface on the water. I'm using a tripod and a remote to ensure I don't get camera shake. So if we wanted the water frozen without the motion blur, we would have to increase the shutter speed to around 1/100th of a second, and then we would have to adjust either the ISO or the aperture or both. Okay, so let's take a lifestyle shot again with kids playing in water. Now, I want the water frozen, but I also don't want to see a lot of distracting elements in the background, and I just want to focus on my kids. So I want the action frozen, meaning a fast shutter speed, but I want the depth of focus shallow, which means I need a low aperture number. Now, I don't want to set up a tripod because it's kind of a park with kids and it's a bit distracting. So I'm going to try leaning up against a palm tree, and if I still can't get it, then I'll go ahead and use a monopod just to make sure I don't have any camera shake. So let's go ahead and have a look at this. So here I can see them playing in the water. Now I'm taking a bunch of photos really quickly as I see them kind of getting ready for the water to fall. And I'm just experimenting with some shutter speeds. So at f2.8 and at 1/800th of a second, I'm finding I really like what it's doing. But I'm going to go ahead and play around here between 1/600th and 1/1000th and just make sure that it looks good. So how about a daytime touristy type example? Now let's say you're just walking through a city or some cool place like a pier and just snapping photos. Now, when I'm doing this, most of the things that I want to be correctly exposed are going to be in direct sunlight, which is very bright, very harsh, and it doesn't always give the greatest photographs. But often when I'm taking city or tourist type photos, I like to see a little motion of cars and people and things that are moving fast. Not so much that it's distracting or that I'm getting a lot of camera shake, but just enough so that sometimes in some photos it's present. And when I'm taking photos where the scene is what's important, I like to have a higher aperture, so I have a deeper depth of field and I can see more of what's there. Like here, I'm kind of seeing all the rides, everything on the pier. And I know what I want is my ISO to be at its lowest at ISO 100, and the shutter speed is going to vary depending on where I'm pointing the camera, but sometimes I'll keep it around 1/50th and the aperture anywhere from f11 to f16. Now, as I said, I'm a manual shooter, so I do change the settings a lot as I go to dial in the photograph. But this will become easier as you go, and I'll also talk a little bit more about semi-automatic modes that you can use to make this easier in a couple videos. Now, if I'm taking photos where what is important to me is the people, then I'll open my lens wide open, which for The 50 millimeter that I have is 1.4, and this will give me a shallower depth of field, and the attention is going to be more on the people in the photos. But this is going to mean that I'm going to have a much faster shutter speed to get a properly exposed shot. It's worth noting that daylight shots where there are no clouds like today is some of the harshest lighting there is. The shadows are going to be very strong and distinct, and your camera might have a hard time seeing into the shadows and into the light. You just have to decide what is the main subject of your photo and then set your exposure so that's properly exposed. And again, you're just going to have to get the best photos that you can get from it. Sometimes in photography, you don't always get the opportunity to pick your weather, and all I'm really trying to teach you is get the right exposure so you can get the best photos that you can for what you have. And sometimes you might have the luxury of visiting a place over and over until you have the cloudy skies that you want. But if you don't, it's not something to panic about or to get bummed out about. Just know your settings on the camera so that you can get the best photos that you can for the time that you have. And then if you have the opportunity, go back later and get some more photos. For me, for example, I've been to Santa Monica Pier a number of times, and I know that some of the best lighting of this is at night because it's got a bunch of neon lights and the rides are lit up. It's kind of hard to see people's faces if you're not around those lights, but it's much more colorful and vibrant. And if I was really serious about taking photos here, I'd probably either do it at sunset or late at night. So for this daylight portrait, I know that I want it bright, but not too bright. I want really shallow depth of field where I only focus on the face, and I don't want any motion blur on the subject. So I know I need to be around ISO 100 with an aperture of f2.8, which is as low as this lens goes, and my shutter speed is going to be around 1/100th of a second, or maybe faster if I can. Let's see what this looks like. Just forward that way again. There you go, that's very nice, right there. Little fairies flying around your ear. Okay, you're closing your eyes in that one because there probably was a bug there. Okay, I'm gonna get a little bit further away. Okay, good. Now look over this way. Okay. Right there. And this actually looks really nice. It looks a little bit dark here, but I know that I can bring that up when I go to edit the photo in Photoshop or Lightroom. So how about a nighttime portrait? So it's generally a dark scene, but I want the model to be well lit. So I've positioned her near a light. I want shallow depth of field, but not too shallow. I want to be able to see some details in the background. So I don't want the apertures totally wide open. I don't want to shoot slower than 1/100th of a second to ensure she stays sharp, so I need to boost my ISO, and if I want to mush out the lights, I can open up the aperture all the way, and those points of light suddenly give me a beautiful bouquet. All right, so while the primary thing we've been talking about is exposure, do you see how you can use ISO, shutter speed, and aperture to get very different shots creatively? And we haven't even really begun to talk about creative choices with lenses. But before we get into that, there is one last thing I want to ensure you have straight about talking about ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, because chances are you've heard it or read about it. So what is a stop in photography? At the risk of giving you too much information, I want to clear up something that relates to ISO, shutter speed, and aperture that many photographers have overheard but don't really understand. And once I explain it to you, I'm going to tell you why it isn't that important anymore. Do you remember how we talked about that when you increase sensitivity from ISO 100 to 200, you were getting double the amount of light? Or when you increase the size of the aperture from f16 to f11, you were also getting double the amount of light? Or if you left the shutter open longer, going from a shutter speed of 1/250th of a second to 1/125th of a second, you were also getting double the amount of light? And if you were to reverse all of these numbers, each would give you half as much light. In photography, this doubling or halving of the light is referred to as a stop or a full stop. Going from ISO 100 to 200 is increasing one full stop of light. Going from ISO 200 to 400 is also increasing one full stop. Going from ISO 400 to 1600 is increasing two full stops. You get this, right? It's doubling the ISO number equals double the light. So when you hear someone talking about increasing the ISO 2 stops, they mean they are going from ISO 100 to 400 or 800 to 3200. The full stops in ISO are 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400, 12,800, and so on. There are finer adjustments these days, but there didn't used to be. It's the same with shutter speeds. Full stops and shutter speeds are 1/8000th, 4000th, 2000th, 1000th, 1/500th, 1/250th, 1/25th, 60th, 30th, 15th, 8th, quarter, half, 1 second, and so on. Now the full stops for aperture aren't quite as easy to remember. f/64, f/45, f/32, f/22, f/16, f/11, f/8, 5.6, 4, 2.8, 2, 1.4, and 1. That's right, f/64 to f/45 is double the light, not f/22 to f/11. It's a little confusing at first, right? And to make matters worse, now cameras can divide all of these into much smaller fractions to give you more precise control of your exposure. It's great control, but it sure gives you a lot of numbers to remember. And all of that can be a little confusing or overwhelming when you begin photography. But guess what? The whole point of all these numbers is to simply help you use your exposure triangle to get a correct exposure on your image. Back when you were shooting on film, you wanted to make sure you had everything set perfectly, so when you went down to develop your film, you didn't find out you had a bad exposure. But now, with a digital camera, because you can see your exposure immediately, it's really not as important as it once was. So don't worry about remembering all the numbers for right now. Just remember what they do and what they're for. And as you get more and more experienced, you naturally begin to remember all these numbers, and eventually you'll have them memorized. If you just remember your exposure triangle and ISO, shutter speed, and aperture and what they control, you are well on your way to getting perfect exposures every time. All right, so what is aperture? Well, for the one-sentence answer, aperture is a word which means an opening or a hole. And in photography, aperture refers to the hole in the lens where light passes through to hit the sensor or film. The word refers not only to the hole itself, but more commonly it is used to refer to the size of the hole. Now, we've got a lens here, and if you look through your lens, you will notice there is an opening which can be made wider or narrower, and which will either let more or less light through it. This is what we're talking to when we refer to an aperture. You might not be able to find it if you have an automatic lens, but most manual lenses do have this control which you can modify easily. Let's go into this in a bit more detail now. In its essence, aperture is similar to ISO and shutter speed in that it helps control exposure by controlling the amount of light reaching the camera's sensor. In fact, it is ISO, shutter speed, and aperture which are often considered the three most crucial concepts for any photographer to grasp. Out of these three controls, aperture can be the most confusing for people to grasp, but it's actually really simple. Here's how I usually start to explain aperture to someone. I want you to examine a lens that every single one of us has. This is our eye. Go to a mirror in your bathroom and take a good look at your eye. Look at the black area in the center of your eye. Relating it to lenses, the size of that hole in the colored part of your eye could be considered the aperture. Now, if you turn off the light in your bathroom, you will see that the hole grows much larger to let more light in so you can see better with less light. Okay, now go ahead and turn the light on, and it once again grows smaller to let less light in so you aren't blinded by the light that's there. So lens aperture actually works the same way. Instead of the eye's pupil getting bigger or smaller, a mechanical device made up of small pieces of metal or plastic open and shut to make the hole smaller to let less light in, or makes it bigger to let more light in. Now, when you're exposing a photo, too small an aperture can make it underexposed because it doesn't have enough light. And if you have too large an aperture, it can make it overexposed because now it has too much light. Again, what you're searching for is the perfect aperture, or the Goldilocks aperture, which is just right for the photo you were trying to take so you get an excellent exposure. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take a few shots of our model here on the bridge so you can see what this looks like. Let's do some photos. Okay, go a little bit to your left because there's just like some harsh sun on you now. There you go, that's nice. Okay. Okay, so I am going to go ahead, and this is going to be underexposed a lot. Okay, as you can see, that's, look off kind of like up over at that tree. Okay, again, I'm bringing this down. Okay, so that's too much. Okay, 1 second here. Now I'm gonna show you overexposed. Okay, and now we're gonna look for a setting that's just right. Pretty nice. One more. Look up just a little bit. Thank you. Nice. A little less. There we go. Okay, good, nice. 1 second here. Okay, good. And now go ahead and open up your parasol. I'll tell you in just a second. So go ahead and put it a little bit behind you, how you just had it. There you go. Thank you. Okay. Good. Now go a little bit to your, actually, you know what? Hold the parasol up so it's kind of shielding you from the light on that side. Good. Turn it up. There you go. Okay. Now put it behind you, kind of le classique. Okay. Good. Now go walk to your right. See? A little bit more. There you go. Stop there. Okay. 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 Okay, one more. Nice, thank you. Similar to shutter speed and ISO, there are numbers which help you accurately communicate the amount of light being let in by the changing size of the aperture. So let's talk about these. Shutter speed was first and foremost used to control exposure and get a sharp image. It wasn't until much later that it also began to be used as a way to creatively freeze motion or show movement. Now there are 4 factors that are going to be your main deciding points as to which shutter speed you're going to use. The first is 1, how much light do you need to correctly expose the image? During the day, you've got plenty of light, so you can use fast shutter speeds. And at night or in dark locations, longer shutter speeds can be crucial when you need a lot of light. Also remember that shutter speed isn't standing alone here. Exposure can be helped by your ISO or ISO and by your lens, which we will get to in the next section. Now let's take a photo that doesn't have enough light and one that does have enough light, just by adjusting shutter speed. So the second factor in determining shutter speed is how fast are the objects you are photographing moving. If you want them to be sharp, then the faster they are moving, the faster the shutter speed has to be to capture them crisply without motion blur. For example, if I have my shutter speed at 1/30th of a second and she's standing still, she looks pretty sharp. But if she's walking, she's still sharp-ish, but not as sharp. But if she's running at 1/30th of a second, she's going to be blurred. But if I didn't want this, I could change it to 1/100th of a second or faster, and I would then have a sharp shot. 3. Are you shooting handheld or with a tripod? Blur caused by accidental camera shake when hand-holding your camera can be avoided by increasing shutter speed. If you're shooting handheld, you will need a faster shutter speed to ensure the movement of your body doesn't create unwanted motion blur from camera shake. Obviously, a tripod eliminates this, but you can also find something to lean against to help stabilize you. Advancements in camera stabilization are making handheld at slower shutter speeds possible, but at a certain point, not even image stabilization will save you. Let me show you a few shots here just so you can see what I'm talking about. Obviously, there's some slight exaggeration here to make a point, but still, it is what it is. Look, at the end of the course, I'll teach you a simple formula for calculating shutter speeds for handheld work. But for now, I just want you to remember that faster shutter speeds equal less camera shake during handheld work. So if you had to shoot handheld and you were getting blur from camera shake, you would simply increase the shutter speed until it was fast enough to catch the image. And if it was too dark for your photo, you could either increase your ISO or change the settings on your lens to let in more light, or do both. We'll talk about the settings on your lens in a moment. So exposure, handheld versus tripod, and how fast your subject is moving are all technical considerations you think about when deciding what shutter speed to have. Now, the fourth and most important thing to consider when deciding your shutter speed is, what artistic effects are you trying to create to tell the story in your photograph? Sometimes motion blur is highly desirable as an artistic choice, and sometimes a complete lack of motion blur is as well. So let's take a look at a couple examples, and let's start with a carousel, and let's take some photos that are properly exposed with motion blur and without motion blur. Other than the fact that they put horrible looking LED lights on this carousel, I just want you to pay attention for how streaky things are and how streaky they're not just when I'm changing my shutter speed. It gives us two very different images, because one, she just looks like she's just standing there frozen, and other, you can tell that there's actually movement happening. But here's the point. Other than exposure, there are two basic uses of shutter speed: freezing movement or showing movement through blurred action. So let's look at a couple creative ways you can use shutter speed as a tool in your photographic arsenal. All right, so now we're going to take a couple shots with my kids playing in the water. I personally love the look of having frozen drops of water around kids and their excited faces. It feels like this beautiful frozen moment in time. And now, because the kids are moving so fast, if I try to do it with a slow shutter speed, they're going to look blurry as well. So I'm going to show you a few different settings on this. One where I'm freezing the drops of water, and one what happens when I try it with a slow shutter speed and you see everything blurry. I'm sure you know this, but just worth mentioning is during sports photography, they often use very fast shutter speeds to freeze the moment, like when the quarterback's catching the ball or something like that. All right, so let me show you with my kids. First, I'm going to take a couple photos here. I'm going to just sort of wait for the moment where this bucket tips down on them and they're splashing and they're screaming and happy. And I'm using a fast shutter speed somewhere around 1/800th of a second. Okay, so let's see how a slower shutter speed can make something look different. We're going to take a shot of the ocean. In this photo, you can see that the ocean waves are very crisp and distinct when I have my shutter speed very fast at around 1/250th of a second. But now I'm going to play around with this a little bit, slowing the shutter speed down gradually, trying to give the water a little bit more of a graceful presence, just to kind of show that there's motion or movement in it, to try and get some crashing on the rocks. I just think it'll make for a more interesting photo. All right, so now we're going to do a shot with the cityscape here on the Mulholland Overlook. Now I want you to take a look at the shots that I'm taking here, and I'm going to start with a very medium shutter speed, let's say 1/100th of a second, maybe a little faster. So now I want you to take a look as I step through the shutter speeds, and you can see as it's gradually getting slower and slower. Using slower shutter speeds like this shot with the blurry streaks at night here is often referred to as long exposure photography. But long exposures aren't just to get streaky lights. Photographers also like to use long exposures to smooth out the surface of water and also sometimes to get blurry clouds in the sky. Doing long exposures during daylight can be a problem with having too much light, but I'll talk about how we solve that much later in the course. For now, remember, we're just looking at entering streaks or motion as an artistic effect. Now, there are also times when you want some parts of the image with motion blur and others without to sort of help show movement and what is moving in the photo. Now, this can be done by moving your camera and following your main subject and letting the rest blur. This is called panning because you pan the camera to follow the subject. And just in case you were wondering, this motion on a tripod head is called panning left or panning right, and it's short for panorama. Panorama. But I also like to think of it sort of like panning for gold, because sometimes you have to try a lot to get the image you want. And this is usually much easier to do on a tripod or monopod, but it can also be done handheld. Let's have a look. We're going to be on the beach again, and we've got our model riding, and I'm going to start taking some shots here following her with a slower shutter speed. And one thing I noticed right away is that I'm sort of struggling dealing with how harsh the light is here. But I'm just going to go ahead and keep tweaking my settings and just trying over and over until I get kind of a shot that I want. This effect is also used a lot in certain sports and racing photography where just having a frozen moment looks pretty boring. And that's why sometimes when you use this effect of panning, you can get some great shots that help tell a story about that moment or help the viewer experience what the moment is like. So I've now shown you a bunch of different examples, and I'm sure you can think of more. The point is that the motion blur you can get from adjusting your shutter speed can be used to beautiful effect as an artistic photographic choice. The important thing is knowing when to use it, either as your personal choice or what your client wants to pay for. Once you've settled that, you know that it's just a tool you can use to help get a better image or help tell the story or the movement of that image. So let's summarize what we've learned here on shutter speed. shutter speed helps you get a correct exposure on your photograph by controlling how long light is let into the camera for. But it also gives you another technical and artistic factor you must control, which is how much motion blur is present in the picture. And as you've seen here, there are really three factors which influence motion blur. That is the speed of the object moving, the speed of the shutter, and the speed of the movement of the camera. Think of it as a triangle of motion blur, where changing any one of those factors changes the amount of motion blur and the type of motion blur in your image. So let's say we're doing a night shot, kind of like at a location like this, where you don't have a lot of light, you can't add more, you don't want a lot of noise, and you don't want motion blur, so you need a lower ISO and a faster shutter speed, both which tend to mean a darker image. What could we do to capture more light? Well, you have another weapon in your exposure arsenal, and that is your lens. If you look at your lens, you will notice that it has an opening so that light can pass through it. The great thing is that this opening can be adjusted to let more light or less light in, which is obviously a major tool for controlling your exposure. The size of that opening is referred to as the aperture, and with ISO and shutter speed, it's the third major factor for controlling exposure. So let's find out about it. All right, so let's talk about lenses, and let's talk about how to talk about lenses. Now, photography, just like any other technical field, has a language of specific terms that are used to communicate precise concepts quickly. You don't go into a photography store and see a bunch of pro photographers standing around saying, "Hey, do you have a lens which can get me a really blurry background that I can use to get closer and further away from my subject without having to walk?" That's just not something you hear very often. Now, there are many different types of lenses and different ways to identify them. And while I will do a full course on lenses, I want to introduce you to the basics of them now. So let's talk about the two types of lenses, primes versus zooms. The title might be a bit misleading because there's obviously a ton of different types of lenses on the market, but these all fall into two basic categories, primes or zooms. So what's the difference? Well, a prime lens has a fixed focal length. It's a 35mm lens and that's it. Or it's a 50mm lens and that's it. Now, a zoom lens has variable focal length ranges. For example, it could be a 70mm to 200, or it could be a 16mm to 35 zoom lens. This means that you can shift the focal length by moving the lens forward or turning a ring on the lens to move the lens elements inside to increase or decrease the focal length of the lens. For example, this right now is on 28. By moving that, I've now changed it into a 300mm lens. There's nothing on this 50mm lens that's going to let me do that. Or, for example, on this Canon lens, it does have the zoom, but it's actually built into the body, so there's no moving part outside of it. Okay? So, zoom lens, variable lengths. Prime lenses, fixed lengths. Okay? So that's prime versus zoom. Another thing that you may have heard about is when a lens is a fast lens or a slow lens. Now, when a photographer is talking about how fast or slow a lens is, they're referring to the maximum aperture that can be achieved on that lens, or its maximum f-stop. Remember, f-stops are ratios or fractional, so a maximum f-stop will be stated as its lowest number. If you have a lens with an f-stop range from f1.5 or f1.4 to f22, so somewhere on this lens, it's going to have where it says 1.4, which this does. And this tells the photographer that the maximum aperture that this can achieve is 1.4. If you look at another lens, it might be f4, which will be also on the front. And here again, it says f4. So I know that the maximum aperture that this can reach is f4. So what do we know about the aperture? Well, the larger the aperture, the more light that goes in. The more light you have, and the faster you can get a proper exposure. So lenses with low f-stop numbers, usually between 1.2 and 2.8, are referred to as fast lenses. There are even some brands with lenses that open to very wide apertures that market them as super speed lenses. So a lens that can open to an f-stop of f1.4 is much faster than a lens that can only open to f5.6. Reversely, lenses with smaller maximum apertures, say from f8 and above, are considered very slow lenses. I actually don't even know if there are lenses that start at f8, but you get the point. Let's talk about the next thing. What is a long or short lens? Sometimes you'll hear a photographer say, "I'm going to shoot it with a really long lens." But when a photographer is talking about a long or short lens, they're informally referring to its focal length, which you know about from the earlier chapters. So, when do you refer to a lens as long and when do you refer to it as short? Well, this changes from photographer to photographer. But generally speaking, anything from 6 millimeters to 50 millimeters might be considered a short lens. And anything from 70 millimeters and on up could be referred to as a long lens. But it actually really gets more precise than that. Truthfully, I've never heard anyone say they wanted a short lens. They definitely call the shorter focal lengths wide-angle lenses or wide lenses, maybe. You basically hear people say they want a long lens or a wide lens. Seems to be a lot of tension on width and length, but that's beside the point. Let's talk about the categories lenses are broken into. So I'm just going to give you a rough overview of focal length naming. Now, in the last 150 years, lens construction has gone from being a mechanical necessity to an art form in itself. Now, there are thousands, tens of thousands of different types of lenses floating around out there. You already know what a fast or a slow lens is, and you know how it relates to aperture. Now let's talk about naming conventions for focal lengths. So when referring to the focal length of a lens, you don't just call them long or short lenses, which is more of an informal reference. Remember again that when you change focal length, you are changing your angle of view, meaning the longer the focal length, the narrower the angle of view. The shorter your focal length, the wider the angle of view. So the categories pros and manufacturers classify lenses for easy communication are: you have wide angle and extreme wide angle lenses. You have standard lenses, you have telephoto and super telephoto lenses. There's also variations of this. For example, extreme wide angle lenses are usually from 6 millimeters to 16 millimeters. Then wide angles are kind of somewhere around 16 millimeters to 35 millimeters. Standard lenses are usually from around 35 millimeters to 70 millimeters. Telephoto lenses are usually somewhere around 85 to 200. And then super telephoto lenses are generally considered anything above 200 millimeters. All of these are available as prime lenses and zoom lenses. There are also a couple specialty lenses on the market as well. The most common ones that you'll hear about are macro lenses and tilt shift or perspective correction lenses. All right, let's talk about the easy one first. So macro lenses are lenses which are designed to get really close to something and to magnify it so that you can see really small details really large in your photo. This is kind of where you get photos of flowers and insects and jewelry and products and stuff like this. Now, macro lenses tend to have longer focal lengths, like 50 millimeters or 85 millimeters, 100, 135, and even 180. Now, a macro lens doesn't really describe a focal length, but rather a type of lens where you can get very close to the object you're focusing on and magnify it greatly on the image. And there are many focal lengths which could be a macro lens. So the next type of lens we're going to talk about is a tilt shift or a perspective correction lens. So these were first designed to allow DSLR shooters to get straight vertical lines with their cameras. This way, when they're shooting architecture or photos where it's really critical that the lines are straight, they can adjust the lens in a couple different ways to get them going straight up and down or horizontally. With fixed lenses, that wasn't really possible because you sort of had one fixed angle on the lens and that was it. So several manufacturers started creating these tilt shift or perspective correction lenses so that you could actually get perfect architectural photos with straight vertical line. And then actually shortly after, other photographers found that you could create these cool miniaturization effects with it or selective focus in the frame. And so they started becoming a lot more popular amongst different types of photographers. So really the only other type of lens that we haven't touched upon are what I call special effect lenses. And these can be homemade or they can be manufactured by a specialty lens manufacturer. I'll cover all of this and much more in a lot more detail in its own course. Really all I want you to remember about lenses and referring to them is that they can be fast or slow. They can be long or wide, and really that when you're talking about them to other photographers or when you're asking about lenses, there's really only a few key categories, which again are your wide angle or extreme wide angle, your standard lens, and your telephoto or super telephoto lens. So when do you use what lens? There are no hard rules on when to use what lens for a particular type of shot. It all comes down to tastes and artistic choices of the individual photographer. I'm not going to go into fine details of advanced photographic professions here. I just want to give you some generally accepted guidelines for which lenses are used for what type of photography. So let's get started with natural landscape type shots. The most common focal lengths for landscape photography are generally from 14 millimeters to 35 millimeters. For natural landscapes, photographers normally want to get as much of the scene in the camera as possible, but they usually don't want extremely distorted looks. There are exceptions, of course, but most of these tend to be more with urban landscapes. So as an example, I'm going to shoot the observatory here. Now, I could shoot a wide landscape, but I also might want to get a particular shot with a monument like the observatory in the frame, and I might use a really long lens to get downtown Los Angeles in there as well. Now, for most landscape photographers, having a fast lens isn't necessary, as they're usually shooting at f-stops around f8, f16, and sometimes down to f5.6 or f4. Slower lenses tend to be less expensive, and there are a lot of great lenses out there from all of the major brands. You can also find some great lenses used and super cheap online. You could pick up a great lens for landscape for just a couple $100 or less. So, architectural and real estate photographers generally also use wide-angle lenses, anywhere from 14 millimeters to 35 millimeters. And where accuracy is critical, they might add a tilt shift or perspective correction lens to get the straightest lines possible. Now, these wider angle lenses help make spaces appear larger and capture the widest possible image of the space, which are both important factors when trying to get buyers interested in a property for sale or when showcasing the beauty of an architectural type location. Note that in a lot of real estate shoots, the client may want detail shots of different parts of the house, and a longer focal length lens like a 50 millimeter or an 85 millimeter might be better for getting these closer shots with less distortion. Let's talk about some common focal lengths for portraits and events. For shots which focus on people or people's faces, you're trying to photograph people in the most flattering way possible. Whether it's portraits, weddings, candid photography, or at events, generally you're going to use telephoto lenses from 70 to 200. There are some real jewel lenses for portraits out there at 85 millimeters that you might want to investigate if you're serious about getting the best portraits possible. These are quite expensive, but even on a budget, there's some great 85 millimeters you can take a look at. Yes, at weddings and events, you want to have a wide lens to capture the setting, but the pictures that will be getting the most attention are of people's faces, and you usually want to make them look their best. And this is done with longer lenses. Again, the reason for this is that longer focal length lenses tend to flatten the features on the face and provide a more pleasant bokeh, while the shallow depth of field helps you separate the individual or the subject from the background. Let's compare a few shots here at 35 millimeters, and then at 85 millimeters, and then at 200 millimeters. I'm going to have the model in front of the rocks on the beach just so you can see this, and I'm going to do a full-length model shot of her from head to toe, and I'm also going to do just her face just so you can see the two comparisons. So now in this next shot, let's focus in on the face with a head and shoulder shot at 35 millimeters, then 85 millimeters, and then 200 millimeters. I think you can see which of these is the more flattering type of photo to take. Again, it comes down to taste. There are certainly some great photos that can be had with wide-angle lenses. Which do you prefer? Which do you think a person being photographed would prefer? Go with what you feel is best. Most wedding and event photographers I know keep a 24 to 70 millimeter zoom, a 70 to 200 millimeter zoom, and an 85 millimeter lens as well as their key kit, and sometimes also a very, very fast 50 millimeter lens. They almost always have several good flashes, but that's something you can worry about as you progress deeper into photography. For now, just know, if you're into people and portraits, longer lenses. All right, so a few last comments on lenses. For sports, wildlife, and other types of photos where you have to get really close to a subject that's really far away, you use super telephoto lenses, and these start at 200 millimeters and they go all the way up to 400, 800, 1000 and beyond. They're amazing, but they're really expensive. Macro lens. Now remember, the macro lens is for getting really close to things that are really close to you so that you can make them really large. So I think that a 100 millimeter macro like this is a great lens to start exploring macro photography with. And then once you find out that that's what you love, go ahead and expand on it. But a 100 millimeter macro will take you a long way. When you travel or you're doing a photo expedition, you might be bringing all your gear with you, which could be a lot of lenses and a lot of gear. But I still think it's worth investing in a decent all-in-one lens so that you can snap one lens on your camera and just go out and have fun with it. Now this lens here is a 28 to 300 made by Tamron. Now it's not going to give me the greatest image I could get at every one of these focal lengths. I would need prime lenses for that. But what it does give me is convenience, which is sometimes more important than lugging around a full bag with gear. Anyways, it's an all-in-one lens. And it does kind of pretty much everything for everyone. So it doesn't mean it's going to be great for everyone, but it's worth considering. That's kind of the last lens I want to talk about. And that should give you a pretty good overview on lenses and which lens is used for what. Now, which lens should you get? That's arguably the most dangerous question in photography outside of what camera should I get. So my answer is this. Get whatever lenses you like and that you can afford for the type of photos that you like taking. When you really get into photography, lenses can become an addiction. Which lenses do I want? I want them all. Just kidding, but you get the point. If I had to recommend the best, cheapest lens with the biggest bang for your buck while you're learning photography, I would say get a 50mm lens with the widest aperture that you can afford. The 50mm 1.4 from either Canon or Sony are both can be gotten for less than $100 used online. So it's kind of hard to go wrong. But in terms of a lens recommendation for general photography, I would say get yourself a 24-70 zoom lens or a 24-105 zoom lens with the widest aperture you can afford. Giving you any recommendations beyond that, I would say it depends on the type of photography you're drawn to. Once you know what you want to shoot, you could research the best lenses for the job. Yes, there are lots of other lenses out there and lots of manufacturers. And hey, if you can afford them, buy them all. But one important thing is don't get caught up in trying to figure out which lens and getting obsessed in the details of lenses over getting out and taking photos. Gear is always something to really easily get fixated on, and it's always more important to go out and take photos. With a used camera, an excellent used camera, and a 50mm lens, which you could pick up for a few $100, you can go out and take some amazing photos. Okay, so just a quick comment on sensor size. I briefly mentioned in one of the earlier videos that the size of your sensor on your camera affects your depth of field. Well, it also affects which lenses you can use. Different camera manufacturers have different cameras with different size sensors and different lens systems designed for these sensors. It's sort of like a Lego thing. You kind of have to mix and match till you find the right one. So there are a lot of sensor sizes out there now, but in DSLR photography like this, there's two main sensor sizes. One that is called full frame, which is a sensor that is basically 36mm by 24mm, and that's basically the size of the old 35mm film. The other dominant size in the DSLR market is what is called APS-C, or Advanced Photosystem Classic, and it is basically 25.1mm by 16.7mm, and it matches another type of film from the time past too. And yes, there are many other camera sensor sizes, but here's really what I want you to see in this video, which is what happens when you mismatch lenses to sensors. So have a look at what happens when I put this lens, which is designed for a smaller sensor camera, onto a camera with a full frame sensor. So I'm going to go ahead and take the photo. And at its widest, you'll see there's a really heavy vignette around the edges. And even if I punch in all the way on this, which is going from 10mm focal length to 20mm focal length, I still have a heavy vignette around the edges, which means I can't use it. Or I have to crop in a lot. So reversely, putting lenses that are designed for large sensors onto smaller size sensors will give you a very different image size, because what's basically happening is you're changing your focal length. Because basically the image coming through the lens doesn't fit on the entire sensor, it's just going to take a smaller portion out of it. So it's cropped. And what this means is, if you have a 35mm lens that's designed for a full frame camera, if you put it on a smaller sensor, you might get what looks like a 50mm lens. This is what's called crop factor. Now again, I feel like taking up all this detail of lenses and sensors is better in its own course, so you don't get swamped with a bunch of excess technical information right now. Really, the only point I'm trying to make is that when you're buying lenses, make sure that the lens you buy is matched to the camera sensor inside your camera. And a lot of times you might like a lens that's made by a company that didn't make the camera, but that made a mount so that it'll actually work on the camera you have. Just be sure to check and do a little research to make sure that that lens fits to the sensor that's in the camera. All right, so let's talk about the problems with longer shutter speeds. The longer the camera shutter is open, the more light is captured, but also the more possibility of objects in the photograph being blurry due to movement. Nothing on this planet is perfectly still. When you take a photo of mountains and stars at night, they can appear to be still at first, but the longer your camera shutter stays open, the more you will see that everything on the Earth, and even the Earth itself, is in constant motion. Now look, all motion is relative to what is seen to be not moving. We may be shooting through space at some ungodly speed, but that vase of flowers doesn't really seem like it's going anywhere fast, does it? Nope, doesn't seem to be moving too much. Now look, if you remember that when you put your ISO up too high to try and capture more light, you got problems with noise in the image, right? Well, with shutter speed, the longer you have your shutter open, the more likely it is you're going to capture motion in your image as well. But motion on a still image shows up as what? It shows up as a blur or a streak. Now this blurring or streaking can be an artistic choice, or it can be a technical mistake. Let's finish this particular section talking about the mistake aspect. And in the next video, we can get into the artistic side of getting blur into your photographs. So let's say you have to shoot a photo with very little light. It's nighttime, whatever. And you know that you want to keep your ISO low so that you don't get a bunch of noise in your image. So you might think that you can just go ahead and simply slow down your shutter speed so the shutter is open longer and you let more light in. But if you do this, you will rapidly encounter two problems. Problem one, if the camera moves at all while the shutter is open, the image is going to be blurry. This is called camera shake and results in the whole image being slightly blurred or not sharp. This is usually a mistake, and it happens a lot when you hand hold your camera at slow shutter speeds. In other words, when hand holding your camera, the longer your shutter is open, the harder it is going to be to get a crisp, sharp image. Here I'm going to show you the image sharp and blurry from camera shake. Now you can fix this using a faster shutter speed, but let's say you really needed a slow shutter speed. No problem, you think. That's what a tripod is for. Or if you don't have a tripod handy, you can just set the camera down to take the photo and eliminate that camera shake. But there's another potential problem with slow shutter speeds. Problem 2. Even if your camera is still, you might be trying to photograph a subject that won't keep still for very long, and so the subject itself is blurry. This is referred to as subject motion. The longer the shutter has to stay open, the harder it is to avoid subject motion. Just like camera shake, unintentional subject motion is also a mistake. Let's have a look at it. I've got the camera stabilized, but she's moving. But we are very lucky with all these new super sensitive cameras. In the early days of photography, because the film sensitivity required a lot of light, photographers had to leave the shutter open for a long time, and people really had to try hard to stay still long enough to get a sharp photo. And that's really not much of a problem anymore. Now what I want you to do is a quick exercise with your camera and with no tripod. Take whatever you have that is your motion object and set it up in front of you. I've got this little twirly toy here. Now take your camera and set the mode dial to S or TV. This mode is shutter priority and it adjusts the exposure in the camera relative to the shutter speed you set. I'll go into camera modes more at the end of this course. For now, just roll with it. Also, if you have a lens with image stabilization, that's great. Just go ahead and shut that off for now. It does help reduce camera shake, but for now I want you to turn it off because that's kind of the point of this exercise. Okay, so I want you to go ahead and get your little gizmo or whatever you're using in motion and start at 1/1000th of a second. Then I want you to go ahead and drop it down to 1/500th of a second. Okay. That's 1/250th. That's 1/125th. That's 1/60th. That's 1/30th. Going down to 1/15th here. Okay, and I'm using the table and sort of bracing myself to kind of help stabilize this. But now if I try and hold it without anything, yeah, and you'll see really quickly that it starts getting completely unusable. Okay, so what's the point of this exercise? Really, all I want you to see is that the slower the shutter speed is, the more motion you can see both in the subject that's in the frame and the motion that you get from holding the camera. Now, I mentioned that there can be an artistic reason to introduce movement into your still images. Movement in a still image is called motion blur, and it is one of the most powerful and artistic aspects of photography. So let's talk about it. So what is noise, you ask? Well, to explain it simply, it is when the sensor doesn't get enough light. It creates small patterns in your image which look a lot like how grain used to look on the older film cameras. And now on digital, the higher you crank up your ISO, the more obvious noise becomes. So let's take some examples here where I'm going to force the camera to have higher ISO, just so you can see this. So I'm gradually going to go up from the bottom, higher and higher and higher. Now I know it sounds really obvious to say this, but remember, just because you're cranking up the ISO, it doesn't mean you're actually adding more light. You're just making the sensor more sensitive to the light that is there. And when the sensor just doesn't have enough light, that's when you're really going to start to see noise. And it can be really obvious on video footage. Do you see the problem? Do you see that the higher the ISO, the more the noise is evident? The good news is that software can already deal with a bunch of the noise issues you can have, and digital sensors are getting better and better at handling noise. And within a few years, this will probably no longer be a problem at all. I shot with the Sony a7S II in the desert, lit only by moonlight, and it was actually pretty spectacular. So you get that higher ISO means more possibility of noise, right? Don't worry about this for now. I just want you to remember a general rule of thumb, which is that you want to use the lowest ISO possible when taking your shots. Daylight shots like this are easy. You just keep your camera at ISO 100 or ISO 50 if you have a camera that can do that. And also realize every camera sensor is going to have what it's called its native ISO, meaning what the ideal ISO rating is for that sensor with no electronic modification being used to brighten or darken it, which theoretically means less noise. But at the beginning stage of the game, this isn't really important. Just know that in the future, you can research out what the lowest ideal ISO is for your specific camera and shoot with that. For now, daylight, ISO 100, you're going to be pretty good. All right, so by now you should understand that ISO controls how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. And you should also understand that you don't want to get noise in your image, so you want to use the lowest ISO possible. So what I want you to do now is I want you to practice with this. Go ahead and put your camera onto the auto setting of your camera and take a look at your flowers or whatever it is that you're photographing. Go ahead, get them in focus, and get a photo of it. Now, assuming your camera is working right, you should have a nicely exposed image. Should be pretty good. Maybe not perfect, but your auto setting, I'm assuming, is doing a pretty good job. So then what I want you to do is I want you to go ahead and move your camera over onto the manual setting. Now, in most cases, it should keep the settings that your camera had on automatic over to manual. And then I want you to go ahead, focus your shot, take it. You should be at ISO 100 if you're in a bright daylight setting. If you're not, go ahead and go into your ISO controls, start at 100, take a photo. Then I want you to go ahead and bump your camera up to 200. Take another photo. Go ahead and bump it up again, up to 400. Bump it up again, up to 800. Bump it up again to 1600. Bump it up again to 3200. So just practice with the ISO going up and down until you really get a feel for how increasing ISO makes the image brighter and decreasing it makes it darker. And then when you've got that, let's go ahead and jump into the next video where we talk about the next tool for controlling your exposure, shutter speed. Most people know there is a setting on the camera called white balance, and it has something to do with something called color temperature. Now, photography can often be accused of having confusing or hard to understand terms, and using temperature to describe light certainly is no exception to the rule. But throwing aside the long, complicated math and physics explanations, let's get to a simple one-sentence explanation of what color temperature is. Simply put, different light sources have different colors, and these are numbered with a system that has to do with how hot a surface is heated to and the color of the light that comes from it. All right, so that might have been a little too short. Let's go into this in a little more detail. If you care to, there's some fascinating discussions online about why light color is measured by temperature. But for this subject, let's keep it relatable. Have you ever seen a piece of metal being heated by a blacksmith or a metal worker on a construction site? As it warms up, it starts getting orange, orangey red, and then yellow, and then finally white. Have you ever heard of the phrase white hot? So color temperature is kind of sort of like that. So I know somewhere out there is a physics professor slamming her head on the table at my oversimplification, but I'm trying to keep this relatable. So in photography, we measure the color of light on a temperature scale called Kelvin, or degrees Kelvin, was just a scientific way of measuring heat invented by, you guessed it, Lord Kelvin. As the degrees increase, the color goes from a very warm white at around 1000 Kelvin up to a purer white around 5500 Kelvin, and then gradually a more bluish white. You can see here on the graphic how this sort of works. Now, isn't it great that usually when we think of warmer light, it's actually a colder color temperature, and when we think of cooler light, it's actually a hotter color temperature? Our brains have clearly been wired to make this easy to understand and not confusing at all. However, I know that this was a struggle for me at first, so let's go into this into some more detail so I know that you got it. Here is why color temperature is important, because different types of light have different colors. You know a sunset is much warmer than early afternoon light, right? Now you know that a candle flame, or any flame for that matter, is a different color than a fluorescent light fixture, right? Or that tungsten lights, these old-fashioned looking ones, are a lot warmer than what you might see in your bathroom, for example, with those type of fluorescent lights, or LED. Now your brain automatically adjusts to the color of light that is present, but a camera doesn't really know what the color temperature of the light is that it's looking at. It can take a guess and sometimes be right, but when it is wrong, all the colors in the scene will look wrong. And the way you fix that is by setting what is called white balance, so you're capturing the correct color temperature and have the right colors for your scene. So what is white balance and why do you have to set it? Well, when we talk about light, pure white is a color that is made up of equal amounts of red, green, and blue. It's a neutral color because it has this balance where each of these colors are equal. Pure gray is also a neutral color. White or gray can be made warmer or cooler by adding color, but it will no longer be a purely neutral color. So setting white balance is when you tell the camera how to interpret the pure whites in your scene so that it can figure out the correct color temperature of the dominant light and maintain that neutral balance of red, green, and blue to accurately reproduce the colors you have. So let's go over again why we have to do this. Cameras do not process light and color the same way our brains do. Our brain always adjusts to keep the colors correct, but cameras don't. You have to tell the camera what the color temperature of the main light is that's illuminating your scene. This way, it knows how to process the scene to keep the neutral colors neutral and not add an incorrect color cast to it. When white balance is wrong, you can get a warm sunny beach shot that looks very blue or very green. In other words, you have something which should look like this that ends up looking like this. As you can see, this is a problem, and it's why you want to make sure you set your white balance correctly. Camera manufacturers have tried to make this easy for you. They've included a lot of white balance presets you can use. Most cameras will have all or some of these presets. And you'll notice that as the color temperature drops, the light gets warmer. So let's have a look at these. All right, so let's have a look at white balance. The first is auto, and this means the camera's going to try and figure it out for you. The next, we have shade, which is actually, looks like a house there. And this is going to be somewhere around 7,000 degrees Kelvin. The next you have cloudy, and this is around 6,000 degrees Kelvin. Then you have daylight, which is around 5,200 Kelvin. Next you have flash, which is actually a pretty pure white, and that's at around 5,000 degrees Kelvin. Then you have white fluorescent light, which is somewhere around 4,000 degrees Kelvin. Next we have tungsten, and these are the warm lights that you're used to seeing. They've been around for a long time. So also most cameras will have a custom white balance setting, which allows you to use a white card or a gray card that you can take a photo of, and the camera will use that to calibrate the white balance in the camera. And that's usually the most accurate way. You just have to make sure that when you're moving from different scenes that you reset your white balance. Okay, and then most cameras have a K setting, which basically allows you to dial in the Kelvin. The K is short for Kelvin. And you can usually dial it in between 1,000 and 10,000. Now, some people simply leave their white balance setting on auto, which might be fine for them. But if you want to ensure you're capturing the most accurate images, practice setting your white balance until you can easily do it. Now, I would argue that it is better simply to eyeball your white balance and set it than it is to just leave it on auto. Because basically what's going to happen is if you leave it on auto, you might look here and the photo will be in the shade, so it's going to set it for shade, and then you go over there and suddenly it's in the bright sun and it's shifted the color temperature from one photo to the next, now in bright sun. So it can give you a lot of random results. So simply practice setting with either the presets or using your white or gray card or setting your Kelvin until you look at the screen and it seems pretty good. Alright, so let's talk about white balance in the camera raw format, because you've probably heard a little bit about this. Now I'm going to go into a lot more detail about RAW and other camera formats in the final part of the course. For now, just understand that when you record an image in a RAW format, what's basically happening is that the sensor is capturing all the raw, unprocessed light information that hits the sensor on the camera. And this gives you more room to manipulate that image when you go into a photo editing program like Photoshop or Lightroom. One nice advantage to shooting RAW is that it has become less important to worry about white balance for photographers and cinematographers who use the RAW format. Now, why is this? Simply because the information is just the raw light information, you can change what the white balance was when you're editing the photo in Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever program you're using. Now, if you're shooting in JPEG, which is the other most popular camera format, you really do have to set white balance correctly, because what's going to happen is the white balance you set is going to get baked into the image, and then you're going to be fighting that incorrect color when you go to adjust it in Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever. Now look, we're going to go much more into RAW and JPEG and other file formats in the later part of the course. The main point is that if you're shooting in RAW, you don't really need to worry about nailing white balance, but it's still a really good discipline to have, and you should take the extra few seconds that it takes just to look at your whites and make sure that you've got your color temperature set correctly. Now remember, if you're shooting RAW, you can change your white balance later. And the great thing is about this gives you a lot of options of how you can artistically push a photo. Let's take a photo here that was shot with the daylight white balance, somewhere around 5,000, 5,200 degrees Kelvin. But now let's say I want to experiment with it. I can simply click through the different color temperatures to see which one I like, and for this, I'll settle on shade to get a nice warm feel to it, and then I can push this even further in the temperature slider. Now when you're starting out, you can get really stressed about making sure you have white balance correct because you don't want to ruin the photo and all that. But look, at the end of the day, it's about how the image looks. So just keep an eye on your image while you're shooting and make sure you're happy with how it looks when you're taking the photos. At this stage of the game in your photography, it's not something to worry about a whole lot of. As you progress in taking more photos, you'll see that you're going to strive to get better in every aspect of photography and making sure all your settings are perfectly dialed in, not just white balance. Don't let the technical worries stop you from the most important thing, which is actually taking pictures. Okay? So this video was just a quick introduction to color temperature and white balance, and that wraps us up on this entire section of the course. Now we're going to go over the next major part of your photographic tools. That's right, we're going to go into lenses. Okay, so hold on to your seatbelts. I am going to try and give you a 5-minute introduction to Lightroom. Because you really don't need more than that right now. And if you want to go more in depth, there are a lot of fantastic courses which take it up and give you the full indoctrination into Lightroom. And that's not what I'm trying to do here. I basically want to show you what Lightroom is and how to get photos in, retouched, and out in under 5 minutes. So here we go. So this is the Lightroom interface, and what you have at the top is called modules. This is the library module. This is the develop module. These other modules we don't really need to worry about right now. Map is for just showing where your photos were taken. Book, slideshow, print, and web are just different ways to prepare your photos for either a book, a slideshow, a print format, or web. So let's focus here on library and importing photos. So usually what's going to happen is if you have Lightroom open, you're going to plug in your memory card from your camera. Once you have it imported onto your hard drive, then you come into Lightroom and you simply choose Import Photos and Video. So the import window is going to pop up, and what you want to do is you just want to navigate to any folder on your hard drive anywhere that has the photos that you're trying to bring into Lightroom, and you just simply select the photos, and you can choose Check All. You can change the size of your thumbnails down here to whichever size makes it easier for you, and you just want to make sure that this is add, and what that means is it's not creating a new copy. It's just telling Lightroom that in this folder, in this location on your computer, here's where the photos are. And then once you've got the photos selected that you want, you're going to go ahead and just hit import down here. I already have all these photos in my catalog, so it's not letting me re-import them. But you will be able to just simply by clicking on import. Okay, so that's how you get them in. And you can see down here, you have different ways of sorting these. And there's a lot of other things that you can do here, including don't import suspected duplicates. But again, I'm just trying to keep this very simple. You bring in photos in, and that's how you do it. Okay, so now the photos are imported into Lightroom. You're still in the library module, okay? Let's pay attention to that. You're still in the library module, and basically at this point, you can, if you want, go straight over into the develop module and start playing with your photos to get them adjusted how you want them. But it's best to take a little time to just quickly organize up your photos. And this is best done by using Lightroom's tools of organization. And you can assign star ratings to a photo, basically saying on a 1 to 5 stars, this is good. You can decide to put a flag on it, which means you've picked that photo. Or you can put an X on it, which rejects that photo and notes that it is rejected, and it will gray out. Or you can use color labels. And all of these just help to tell you rapidly which photos that you want to use and which photos you don't. So I can use the X key and I could just quickly go through and go, okay, I don't like any of these photos. Okay, I like this one. I'm going to use the P key. And this is generally what I do. I do what's called picks and rejects. And I'll go through all the photos I have and I'll go ahead and pick the ones that I want to work on retouching. Sometimes I'll also use a star based on, like, if I took a bunch of photos, I might go, okay, this is 1 star, this is 2 stars, just to give me some reference on it. Again, all you're doing is organizing your photos by assigning attributes that will help you remember them, either as a pick, a star rating, or if you wish, a color that will help you remember it. There is no set pattern for what you use which for. It's really up to you. If while you're reviewing your photos you want to see them larger, you can click on a full preview down here. There's other things down here, and again, these are best discussed in its own course. I really just want you to understand bring a photo in and how to start retouching it. So what you want to do is create a collection. And what a collection is it's basically photos that you collect to retouch, or you say these are all the photos of this particular time, and you would go ahead and you would create a collection and you would put it name of collection, or we'll just, for the sake of this, we'll say test collection. And if you want to do smaller collections inside it, let's say you did a bunch of photo shoots in one day, you could create a collection set, and then you would be able to put this inside a collection set that already exists. So test collection, there's a thing here which says inside a collection set, include selected photos, and set as target collection. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to not include any selected photos, but we're going to choose set as target collection, and we're going to create that. And it's going to pop up down here as test collection with a little plus sign. And what that basically means is that you can press the B button and it will automatically add to the test collection. Or you could right click on it and remove from target collection or add to target collection. And what this does is it allows you to rapidly pick your photos and put them into collections so that you can easily find them. Let's say you took photos of a bunch of different people on one day. You could create collections by their names. Maybe you have different family members, and you could add specific photos to those specific collections with their names. That could be a useful way to do it. So I've already gone ahead and I've created a little folder of photos, and I'll give you these and a bunch others to retouch on your course. Let's go over into the develop module real quickly. And what the develop module is this is where you develop your photos. This is where you retouch them so they look good. And this is not, again, a course on retouching. I just want to quickly show you how to do basic retouching techniques. Okay, so real quickly in the develop module, you have a navigator which you can use to zoom in and out of photos here. And you have what are called presets. And these are things that just rapidly allow you to put different filters on photos to test different looks. And that's what a preset is. And you can create your own or you can buy them. It's really easy to do, and again, I'm not going to show you how to do it because this is just really quick. So again, these are raw photos, so this is non-destructive editing, meaning I'm not saving this as a final image. This is the photo as it came out of the camera, and here's in the history, this is basically just showing all the different actions that I've done to it, and I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning to unretouched, and I'm going to go ahead and do a quick retouch on this. If you look over here, here's your histogram, and this basically just shows you which parts of the image have certain brightness and color values. Here are a few tools. Crop tool, which allows you to crop and rotate the photo however you want to. You have a couple of different retouching tools up here. This basically allows you, let's say there was, you wanted to get rid of that leaf, it would try and get rid of that little leaf there, or whatever blemish it is that you wanted to get rid of there. This is a red eye removal tool. This is a graduated filter tool, and what this does is you can basically, just like putting the old glass filters on in the front of your camera, you can put something that goes from a lighter or darker. It's going from one value to another value, and by adjusting your filters you can control the strength of it basically, and it's really whatever you want to do is able to be applied by these. And then, let's get rid of that because that looks terrible. You have another type of filter, which is a radial filter. And again, this does the same thing in terms of it gives you an area that is whatever you want to do in terms of the tools you're applying to it, it will constrain it to a radial area. Okay, I'm going to get rid of that again. Okay, and this is a brush tool, which just like the graduated filter and the circle filter, you can brush on corrections wherever you want on this. And also you can click on that and it'll show you where these things are applied. Okay, so I don't want to really get into any of this. What I do want to show you is these panels here. And let's start with the basic panel. Now, this is a color photo, but if you wanted to go to black and white, you could select that and basically it would pull up the black and white tool set, let's say. For now, we're going to stick with color, and let's just go from the top. So here's white balance, and you can choose whichever white balance you want. This is raw, so you can go ahead and change the white balance because it's non-destructively programmed. Sorry about that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stick with as shot, and I'm going to warm it up just a little bit, which here's the temperature. I'm just warming that up just a tiny bit, and that's going to pull up custom. Okay. The tint is just to give you green or magenta. Next up is exposure, darker exposure, brighter exposure. And this is actually pretty well exposed. I like the exposure of the photograph, so I'm not going to do anything with it. Contrast, I always like to just punch up the contrast a little bit. And here it's flatter. Here's really heavy contrast. That's what that's doing. So I'm just going to punch that up just a tiny bit. We're going to go into highlights here, and I'm just going to bring this up a tiny bit. I'm going to bring down the shadows. The shadows here, you can really like push your shadows here. And if you look up at the histogram in the upper right corner here, you can see what's happening as we move these. So I don't really see the need to do anything there. You have your white point, which is basically the pure white in your image, which you can bring up or down. And same for black. And you can bring that up and down to sort of make the image darker and punchier or not. Let's look at presence, and here we have clarity, which basically does a lot of localized contrast and sort of makes the image punchy, and this makes everything sort of soft and glowy. Too much of either is never a good idea. If you're photographing models and stuff like that, you might want to just soften it just a tiny bit. Vibrance is just a way of adding more color. Intelligently adding color, let's just say it's not just doing it in a bucket, it's selectively adding it to make sure it doesn't get oversaturated. Now, why is that? Let's go ahead and oversaturate this, and you can see that that's just, it's way too much, but that is what the saturation slider does. So I'm going to go ahead and just pump up the color a little bit here. I'm going to go ahead and bring that back just a little bit on the color balance. I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit more contrast and bring up the exposure a little bit, not too much. And I'm basically retouched on this photo. I don't like to do a lot of retouching on my photos. I think that you really want to focus on getting the image in camera that you want. And if anything, play with your contrast, your saturation, and your shadows and highlights. But really focus on getting a correct exposure and having a camera that captures colors you like so you don't have to go crazy with it. But that's just me. And let's go ahead, and the tone curve is just another way to adjust parts of your image. I'm going to quickly just skip through these so you see what they are. Color allows you to selectively deal with colors in your image area, like that is taking the color and changing the hue of the color from orange to a red. If you wanted to just saturate that a little bit more, like for her red hair, let's say, you could just pump up that saturation just a tiny bit. And sometimes people really like to pump up their greens when they have greens in the background. Don't go too much because you'll start seeing weird artifacts in the image. Okay? Next is split toning, and I don't really want to go into that. It basically lets you change the colors of it lets you tint your highlight and your shadows to get sort of an interesting effect. Detail has to do with sharpening. Again, not getting into it, just so you know that it's there. Lens corrections, you might want to turn this on, because that basically, if your lens is registered that you shot with, which it probably will be if it's anything close to modern lens, and it will basically help remove distortions that lens might have. So you can go ahead and choose those. The transform is basically just a way to manipulate your image in terms of cropping, and if you have something that's very distorted, you can use this to sort of, like if you have architecture that's awkward or something, you can use this to correct it. And then effects, which is one that I do use a lot, which is I put like a little bit of a vignette on a lot of the photos I do when I have a person there, not necessarily on landscape, but with portraits, and you can go really hammy on that, which is all out, or you can go white if you have maybe a black and white photograph. And the midpoint just selects how far in it comes. Roundness, is it square, is it round? I tend to leave those pretty much at the default settings. Feather is basically how smooth it is. You can also add grain. If you're looking for like an older sort of like more vintage look, you can add grain, and you can control the size of it and the roughness of it. And I'm not going to add grain to this photo. And there are other things that you can monkey with down here, which again, a full course on Lightroom will teach you. What I really want you to know is import a photo and use your basic panel to get your colors and your image basically correct. And if you really wanted to do a quick black and white, you could always just drag the saturation there down all the way down, and you could pump up the contrast to make it a much more contrasty black and white photo. That's a quick black and white, and you can do shades in between. This was really fashionable a bit, those sort of bleached out colors, and that's kind of how they did it. So let's go back to where the saturation was, and I'm just going to bump it up a little bit. And again, it seems just a tiny bit dark now that I've done all this. I'm just going to brighten it up a little bit. And I have no idea what that's going to look like on your monitor, because every monitor is going to be slightly different. There you go. I like how that looks. And as I said, I'm going to give you a bunch of different photos that you can practice on, just to practice retouching photos and really seeing how simple Lightroom is to use. Again, there's 1,000 tools that I didn't go into here, and really all I wanted to cover was bring your photo in, put it in a catalog that you can use to refer to your groupings of photos, and then retouch them using the basic panel. And when you have a photo you like, exporting really is simple. You can simply select one or many photos. Down here, you could select all of these just by clicking and selecting, or you could just select one and choose export, and just go to the top and choose export. You choose the folder, whether it's the desktop, and you go, okay, that's what it's going to be. I'm going to put it in a subfolder, and this will be course photos. And you can rename the file however you want. If you want to rename them, you just go, it's Park Photos 1, or however you want, and you can see down here it's going to say 1 of 1, 1 of 2, 1 of 3, or you could have down here, it'll keep the original photo number there on it, so you have that. And I generally don't rename my photos unless I need to for a client. It just helps me find, refer back to photos, so I keep that off. Video you don't need to get into, and here you have file settings, and JPEG is the most common export for seeing on the web format. And the color space, as we discussed, we're leaving this in sRGB until you really know why you would need these other ones for high-end art photos and stuff. And here, your quality slider really just lets you go, okay, I want it at full quality or somewhere in between. And you just need to monkey with this until you see what you like. Or you can set a specific file size by megabyte. So this is a 1 megabyte photo right now, not very big. Maybe a 5 megabyte photo you would like. However you want to do it. This is where you control it. Next you have image sizing, and you can resize this to fit basically how many pixels wide or tall and what resolution. And that I'm not going to resize it. output sharpening, and this just, when you go from RAW to JPEG, sometimes the image can get a little soft because you're losing information, and you can just go ahead and resharpen this either for screen, matte, or glossy. And then metadata, basically you can remove location info, get rid of stuff, or write information in there which lets people know where the photo came from. You can apply a watermark here, and you can also have some other post-processing options. For most of the times, I don't need really any of this other than maybe I might sharpen for the screen. And I just simply set the location, and I go ahead and hit export. And it will go and export it to that folder on my desktop. Now, if I'm doing a bunch of photos, and I've done that, let's say I've retouched another photo, this black and white one, for example, and it's, you know, it's got the grain and all that, and I go ahead and I can just simply click on it and say export, export with previous, and it's going to go ahead and it's going to put that file right here with the same settings as the last one as it exports it. And that's good to go. Okay, so there you go. That is the simplicity of bringing photos in, retouching them, and bringing them out. And I know I've gone probably like 5 times over my 5-minute thing, and I've skipped out tons of stuff, but hopefully you get the basic step of library module. You go ahead and you import your photos from a folder somewhere on your hard drive or computer. You then select the photos that you want. You can assign stars or pics to them or colors. You add them to a collection over here, and then you take them into the develop module and you retouch them however you would like to, just quickly getting your colors right, making sure that you really get the image that you want if it didn't come out that way out of the camera. Bring down the clarity, and really quickly you can have a really nice looking photo. That's a little too bright. Somewhere around there, a little vibrance. We'll go ahead and add a little vignette to it, just to sort of focus in on the girl. And there we go. I can simply right-click and choose export or export with previous. So I've done you a gross disservice in not covering the thousands and thousands of tools that Lightroom has, and only focused on import, retouch, and export. But again, there's a lot of great courses on this, and I hope that this course has been useful for you and you've learned a lot in terms of how to take photos with the manual setting on your camera, and really to take your photos to the next level by getting off of automatic mode and taking control of your camera. So that really brings us to the end of this course. Now, when I set out to make this course, my goal was to create a set of videos where I could teach someone everything I wish I had known 30 years ago when I first started learning photography and getting serious about it. There are still many things that I want to teach you, including how to turn your love of photography into a successful career, if that's something that you want to do. But I can honestly tell you that anything else I could or would teach you, including filmmaking, all builds on the key fundamentals that I've given you in this course related to photography. So learn and practice what I've shown you in this course. I promise that if you do, your photos will improve significantly. And in closing, the most important thing is always to keep looking at the world in search of images worth saving and sharing, and keep taking photos. Don't let a day go by where you don't break out your camera and take a photo of something. I don't care if that camera is your phone or your DSLR or whatever it is. So I hope this course has been helpful and cleared up any confusions you might have on these key subjects of photography. If you feel like I've left something out that should be included with future updates, or if there's another subject you'd like to see me cover, give me a shout out on social media or email me and let me know. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you next time, and I look forward to seeing the beautiful images that you're going to be capturing. Okay, I think pretty much every new camera made comes with 2 options to shoot: RAW or JPEG, or both. Now, most people have a pretty good idea of what a JPEG is, but kind of a hazy sort of understanding of RAW that starts with, oh, that's that phototype with more data that is a hassle to handle. But if you're into professional photography or really as a serious hobby, Camera Raw is the greatest advance in digital photography since microwave popcorn or sliced bread, or something like that. My point is that if you're serious about photography, you really have to shoot in RAW. Now, let's go ahead and let's talk about these 2 formats so you get a better idea of why I'm saying this. Okay, so what is Camera Raw? Now, RAW files are often referred to as digital negatives because they perform the same function that negatives did in film photography, for those of you who remember that such a thing existed. So Camera Raw, as the name sort of suggests, is a file format that saves the raw light information that the camera sensor has captured. Now, there are hundreds of proprietary RAW formats floating around out in the world. Adobe has DNG, which is short for digital negative. Sony has .arw, Nikon has .nrw, Canon has .cr2, and they're all just variations of the same basic thing. Now, the RAW format exists to capture, with as little loss of information as possible, everything the camera was able to record, as well as relevant camera information such as lens selection, f-stop, shutter speed, ISO, camera type, white balance, and so on. This is often referred to as the metadata. Now, RAW is actually just a bunch of digital information. The computer has to process it so that you can see an actual image that you can share with people. So if you shoot RAW, you're going to have to process it in a program like Lightroom or Photoshop or any of the other various photo editing programs out there, and then save it as a different format to share it so it can be broadly seen. Now, the most common photo sharing format is, of course, JPEG. So what's a JPEG? Well, a JPEG is a computer file format which takes its name from the committee that created the .jpeg standard, the Joint Photographic Experts Group, or JPEG. Now, as a photographic capture format, a JPEG is created by the electronics inside the camera from the raw image information that the camera captures. The quality of the camera usually determines how large the captured image is in terms of megapixels or resolution, and how much light information can be stored in the image, which is dynamic range, and what the color reproduction looks like. JPEG is by far the most widely used capture format in the entire world. Your phones, tablets, the cheaper point-and-shoot digital cinema cameras, and thousands of industrial devices such as security cameras all rely on one form of JPEG or another to capture image information. And why not? JPEG image quality to file size is pretty good. The color information is pretty accurate. It works really well and has for the last 2 decades been the capture format of choice for most photographers on the planet. But in recent years, there has been a steady migration of photographers to the more professional camera capture format of Camera Raw. So let's talk about RAW versus JPEG. So, do you shoot RAW or JPEG? It's an important question to ask, and for the photographer interested in going pro or semi-pro, it's a serious decision to tackle as soon as possible. Okay, so RAW or JPEG is a setting that you decide on your camera for the format that it's going to capture and record the image as. Now, back when camera cards and hard drive space was super expensive, this used to require some serious consideration. And I don't really think it's a big deal these days. Almost anyone serious about photography is shooting RAW these days, even if they also shoot JPEG at the same time. And really, you should just go ahead and set your camera to shoot RAW and JPEG at the same time. Now, if you shoot RAW, remember that RAW is the raw light information as the camera sensor captures it. These files have to be processed in a photo editing program to see and share them. So yes, if you're shooting RAW only, it's more work to get RAW images ready to share, but it's largely automated these days and it's pretty simple. JPEG is the format that just takes the raw information and processes it to add contrast, sharpening, and a lot of color correction and compression to give you a pretty good looking image for a reasonable size, and you can share it right away out of the camera if you want to without having to retouch it. But the camera is deciding a lot of things for you. So let's talk about why you would shoot RAW. Now, when you start editing your photos, you're going to see that the more you blow up the image, the faster the JPEG format starts to fall apart. The more extreme you color correct your images, the faster a JPEG falls apart. For photos that are only going to be viewed on mobile devices or small prints, this isn't such a big deal. But when you start shooting photos that are going to need to be printed large, this is much more important. Now, if you're shooting JPEG only, the camera has already made many of the retouching decisions for you. And while there is some wiggle room, you have surrendered a lot of the control you would otherwise have if you had shot in RAW. As I mentioned earlier, in RAW files, you can always alter the white balance of the photo in the editing process. But with a JPEG, it is locked in and much harder to correct the image for a different white balance. A RAW file not only has a lot more image information, this information gives you a lot more latitude and power in the retouching process. But let's have a look at this. Like, what does it really mean, like in terms of having more image information and and all that. So this is one of the overexposed photo examples that I did. Now this is the RAW photo, and you can see here it says .cr2, that's the Canon RAW format, and this is the JPEG. So now let's take a look at the JPEG and let's go, wow, this is really overexposed. Let's go ahead and see what we can bring down. And as you see, as we bring back some of the exposure, we're still losing a lot of these areas. It's really kind of not really usable. And we can do some things to correct it, but it's not a usable photo by any means. But if we hop over here into the RAW photo, there's a lot more light information that's captured. And as we bring it down, you can see that, okay, there's still a little bit blown out here in the background, but she's actually much more, that's actually a usable exposure on her. And if you compare the two, this here, there's no information left there, whereas here, you can see that it's actually saved that. And okay, that's not that extreme. That's not a big deal, right? So let's go over here. And how do you like this photo, huh? Pretty good. So it's completely underexposed. There's nothing there. Let's take a look at the JPEG first. And let's go ahead and increase the exposure. And you can see there's actually a photo in there. But look, there's nothing here. And it's really yucky. Even if I wanted to cheat and kind of do it in black and white, it really, no, just no. But if we go over here to RAW, and again, I'm not saying you should underexpose your photos this much. My point is that there's actually a surprising amount of information that is present that can be used. And now if I wanted to cheat and actually do a black and white on this, I could actually get away with it. You know, and I might want to tweak a few things to kind of just bring it out. But that photo is actually savable at this point. If for some reason you misset it and that's all you had, that's pretty impressive. And, you know, backlit scenarios, again, a JPEG, you can go ahead and you can bring it up and bring up the shadows. And, you know, but when you zoom in, look at all this noise that's going on here from what you've recovered. And let's see what happens if we do this on the RAW. We'll go ahead and we'll bring up the exposure. And we'll bring up the shadows a little bit. And let's just see if it's as noisy. And you can see it's a lot cleaner. Take a look. Look at that in comparison to that. It's a usable photo. So when I say there's a lot of image information in your RAW photo, I really mean there is. And, you know, again, here's a completely blown out photo. And the JPEG, you know, if we were to try to recover this, you know, that's about what you get back. And on a RAW photo, you know, there's a lot of blown out areas, don't get me wrong, but there's a lot of the image here that you can actually see at this point. And, you know, looking at the two, again, there's ways that you could actually make this photo usable, which would have been impossible here. So that's, yes, it's a larger file, but again, you're protecting yourself so much better. And again, once I save this photo, this is it forever. Like if I was to change the white balance here, let's say I wanted to warm this up and whatnot, and I was to go ahead and save this, that's locked in. But with RAW, I can go ahead and come back and I can keep changing this because every change that I make here in this photo is non-destructive, which is another fantastic feature and why you really should shoot in the RAW format. Good, so let's summarize some of these advantages and disadvantages of the two formats. Other than image information, one of the truly great advantages of shooting RAW is that when you go to edit your photos and retouch them, whatever changes you make can be changed later. If you were going to go ahead and edit a JPEG photo and save changes, those changes are baked in forever. This ability to change everything about a RAW photo later is called non-destructive editing because you never degrade or permanently bake anything into the original. To summarize, what are the advantages of JPEG? Smaller file size, the camera can capture it faster, and it's instantly viewable. So what are really the disadvantages of shooting JPEG? Well, you have less image information overall. And more importantly, your white balance is baked in, and any editing you do on a JPEG photo, once you save it, it's locked in. You can't change it later. Which brings us to the advantages of RAW. You've got more image information, which gives you better color, better detail, better brightness. all the image editing you do is non-destructive. It's much easier to fix over and under exposure. You can get better quality prints, and your white balance can be adjusted at any time, and it really is the way to get the highest image quality from your camera sensor. What are the disadvantages to RAW? Really just two. One, the larger file sizes, and two, the image has to be processed and saved to a different format to share it. So, the moral of the story here is, if your camera has the option to shoot RAW, you really should shoot RAW. And if it has the option to shoot RAW and JPEG, and you're the type of person who likes to share photos right away without retouching, you can shoot RAW and JPEG and share the JPEG now, and then do any retouching on the RAW later to get the final photo that you really want to keep. Remember, size isn't that big a deal anymore because hard drive space has gotten dirt cheap, and your photos don't really take up that much information. And if you're a professional taking hundreds of thousands of photos, buying 8 terabytes or 12 terabytes of a drive really isn't that big of an investment to make for your business. So, shoot RAW, shoot RAW, shoot RAW. All right, now we're going to talk about how focal length affects depth of field. So I'm not going to get into complicated optical or math formulas or anything like that to explain to you why these things work. I just want you to understand how they work and that they do work so that you can use these principles to take great photos. So simply put, the longer the focal length on the lens, the less that's going to be in focus at any one time, and the shallower the depth of field you're going to have. The shorter the focal length on the lens, the more you're going to see, and the more that can be in focus, and the deeper your depth of focus can be at any one time. Now, what makes this even more exciting is that your depth of field can still be influenced by focal distance and aperture. Can kind of get a bit like, trying to balance all these things. But let's do 2 exercises to see how this works. So now we're going to take another photo with our model, and without moving the camera backwards or forwards, or shifting our focal point, or changing our aperture, let's take a photo with several different focal lengths. I'm going to start at 24 millimeters, then I'm going to move up to 35 millimeters, then 50, then 70, then to 85, then to 100, then to 200. Now look at the change in the background and the depth of field. Okay, here we go. This is 24 millimeters. This is 35. This is 50. This is 70. Okay, now I'm going to switch lenses really quickly. This again. Okay. Going back to where I was. This is at about 85. Okay. This is 100. Good. Good. Look out again. Thank you. And here we go at 200. Now let's go through these same focal lengths, but I'm going to try and keep her the same size in every shot. In other words, keeping the subject size the same in the frame. Again, I'm keeping the aperture constant and shooting at different focal lengths, but I'm going to move the camera further away or closer to keep the model looking the same size in each image. Okay, go ahead and come up here. There's a little bit of light left up here, but that's kind of all we got. Okay. Get an 80 officially gone. But, oh well. Okay. Okay. 100. Okay. 200. Cool. Awesome. In both examples, the depth of field changes as we change focal lengths. The longer the focal length, the narrower or shallower the focus is. The shorter the focal length, the deeper your depth of field, and the more that's going to be in focus in the photo. You do see how much of what is in focus and how much is out of focus is changing, right? Good. Let's do it again. So here's another set of photos with the model in front of the bridge. Again, I want you to pay attention to the depth of field first, as I just changed the focal length on my lens. So I'm going to be going from 24 millimeters at f/5.6 and then 35, 50, 70, and 100, showing the change in depth of field. And now watch as I keep the subject size relatively the same, but because I'm increasing the focal length, I have to physically move the camera further and further away to make sure that she stays the same size. Now in both of these examples, I'm not changing aperture at all, but by changing focal distance and focal length, the apparent depth of field is changing pretty radically. If we wanted to tweak this further, we could always adjust what? That's right, we could influence this if we wanted to by changing the aperture or the focal distance or the focal length. I think you get it. All I want you to see in this video is that focal length, like aperture and focal distance, also influence what is acceptably in focus in an image, and I think you've got it, right? You're the one who determines what you want in focus and how out of focus you want everything else to be. And your tools to do that are, once again, 1, aperture. The lower the f-stop, the less you will be able to have in focus because it means a shallower depth of field. The higher the f-stop, the more you will be able to have in focus because it means a deeper depth of field, a deeper depth of focus. Second, focal distance. The closer the object you are focusing on is to the camera, the shallower the depth of field. The further away from you it is, the deeper the depth of field. Also, the further the background is away from the thing you are focusing on, the more out of focus it will be. And third, focal length. The wider the lens, the deeper the depth of field will be. And the longer the lens, the shallower the depth of field will be. There are other things that affect depth of field, including the size of the sensor on your camera, but none of them are as important as these three. Now, just like ISO, shutter speed, and aperture was your exposure triangle, and object speed, shutter speed, and camera movement was sort of kind of like your motion blur triangle, you should consider that aperture, focal distance, and focal length as your depth of field triangle, as shifting any one of these changes depth of field. This is meant to be a global overview, and it's missing a lot of fine details, but in terms of a broad overview, you've got the most crucial components. There's a lot more to know about all of this, but it's much more effective to really get a good understanding of these basic points and then practice all of this until you've really got it before diving deeper. Okay, so now that you know about exposure, let's talk about different ways to use your camera to take photos and get good exposures. I'm assuming that you have a professional or a semi-professional digital camera with an interchangeable lens. I don't care if it's Sony, Nikon, Leica, Canon, Panasonic, Pentax, or whatever it may be. Because I have no idea what camera you have, I only want to cover a few things almost every camera has in common, and also the different modes that each of these cameras share, so you have an idea of how to use them. Let's talk first about the exposure controls. Your camera should have controls for ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Now these may be digital controls via a menu, or they may be via dials or knobs somewhere on your camera. So now I want you to go ahead and find where you control the ISO on your camera. On my camera, it happens to be here in the back via a digital menu. And then I use a dial to go in, or I can use the touch screen to tweak it that way. But I don't know if you have this camera or not, so find out where it is on your camera. All right, good. So next, I want you to find where you control the shutter speed from on your camera. Remember, faster shutter speed, less motion blur. Slower shutter speed, more motion blur. Okay, so I don't know if you have a Canon or not, but somewhere there's going to be a dial, which is going to go ahead, and as you turn it, it's going to be changing your shutter speed. Remember, faster shutter speed means less light and less motion blur. Slower shutter speed means more light and more motion blur. Okay, good. The next thing I want you to find is where you control the aperture on your camera. Now, you may have a manual lens, in which case you'll find the aperture control on the lens itself. But otherwise, usually there's a dial somewhere around where if you rotate it, it will be changing the aperture number on your lens. And again, the higher the aperture number, the less light and the more depth of field you have. The lower the f-stop, the shallower the depth of field and the more light that you have. So go ahead and find out on your camera where you control the aperture. Here I have a dial which controls it, but you may have a dial in a different place or a manual control on the lens itself. And of course, you should be familiar with all the other parts of your camera, such as where you press to release the lens, how you fire off the photo with the shutter release button, and you should have a pretty good working knowledge of what all the buttons and whatnot on your camera at least do. So once you've sort of acquainted yourself with that, I want you to find the mode dial on your camera. And some cameras may have this purely as a digital menu, but I think most of the high-end DSLRs have a mode dial on top. They might differ slightly in terms of the abbreviations that they use and what they have on the dial, but some of the key modes will be the same. So let's talk about that. All right, so let's talk about the main camera modes on your camera. Now, all of these modes are simply here to help give you control and help you nail the exposure so you get the best image. Most cameras have a mode dial, which has some common settings. Now, on one extreme, you have A or auto for automatic, meaning the camera sets shutter speed, aperture, and ISO for whatever it thinks the best exposure mode is. You have no control over exposure in this mode. Then, on the other extreme, you have M for manual mode, meaning you are taking full control of the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture on the camera. The camera determines nothing. Now you have a mode which is A or AV mode. This is aperture value, meaning that you set the aperture and the camera adjusts the ISO and shutter speed automatically to get a good exposure. The next one is S or TV on the Canon dials. Why Canon? Why? But this is for shutter priority or time value, meaning you set the shutter speed and the camera adjusts the ISO and aperture automatically. All right, B or bulb mode is basically for long exposures where the shutter will stay open for as long as you're holding the shutter release button, or if you have a cable, a shutter cable, which will hold it open remotely. As long as you have the button pressed, it's going to keep it open for. Then you have a P mode, which stands for program. So different cameras and different camera manufacturers will have different things you can do in the P mode, but most basically will allow the camera to automatically set the ISO, shutter, and aperture, and then if you want to adjust it, you can change these as you wish. In the beginning, it took me a while to get used to how all these different modes worked, and I wanted to give you just a rapid orientation to them to hopefully speed up the process for you. Let's start with manual mode, because I think it's the easiest to understand. You have to manually set shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. This is the most difficult mode to master because it requires the most skill to get right, but it also gives you the most creative control. But these other modes can be very helpful for you, and many professional photographers use them a lot. So let's talk about how they could be useful for you. It is important to remember that your first decisions about a photo need to be the creative ones. Then you can make the technical decisions that will enable you to capture the image you see in your mind. I usually start with asking myself how much motion blur I want in the photo, if any at all. And then, what is it that I want in focus in the image? And what do I want out of focus? With these two decisions, I can then choose shutter speed and aperture settings to achieve the artistic effect I want. And then I dial in my ISO to get the exposure right. Let's say your primary concern was motion blur, and you knew that shutter speed was the most important thing to control creatively. Well, shutter priority, or time value mode, is essentially where you decide on the shutter speed and the ISO for your shot, and the camera is going to set the correct aperture. Also, if you have your camera on auto ISO, it will change your ISO and aperture to try and get a good exposure for the shutter speed you choose. Now, in shutter priority, because exposure is being controlled partially by the camera, there are two things that should influence your decisions on shutter speed. One, are you shooting handheld or on a tripod? Two, what artistic effect do you want with motion blur in your photo? Of these, the artistic effect is what I'm deciding is the most important decision. As we already went over earlier, if you're going to handhold your camera, you might need a faster shutter speed to keep the shot sharp. But now, let's talk about the artistic for a moment. I have three things I'm doing with shutter speed most of the time that I consider the artistic choices. And these are frozen moments, long exposures, and panning, where I'm following the thing in motion to get a streaky image showing motion. Now you remember that in panning, we have a slightly slower shutter speed while following the object in motion. And let's say I want to experiment with different speeds, but I don't want to have to refigure out my exposure every time. And a situation like this could be very good to use shutter priority, because I can try 1/125th of a second, or 1/60th of a second, or 1/30th of a second, or 1/15th of a second, changing my shutter speed back and forth without having to refigure my ISO or aperture every time, but just focusing on getting the exact artistic effect. So what is aperture priority / value mode? Well, aperture priority mode lets you set the f-stop, and then the camera is going to help adjust the exposure to match whatever your f-stop is so it looks good. Now, most of the time, I like to shoot with my lenses wide open, meaning at their widest possible aperture or f-stop, with the exception sometimes being for landscape or architectural shots. So on aperture priority, this allows me to open up my lens to f2.8 or wider, or adjust my aperture how I want and shoot quickly, because the camera is going to automatically adjust the shutter speed, and in some cameras also the ISO, to be whatever it needs to be to get a correct exposure. So let's see how changing the aperture for this shot, the camera is going to adjust the shutter speed to get a correct exposure. Okay, so right now, she's over here. Go ahead and look that way. Here we are. So right now, I'm at f2.8, and it's giving me a shutter speed of 1/320th of a second. Look up. Thank you. Okay, now I'm not really happy with that. So I'm actually going to bump up my ISO. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and close down my aperture to f4, and it's giving me a shutter speed of 1/125th of a second. So it is making sure that there's more light. Go ahead and look out a little bit that way. Thank you, beautiful. Okay, so it's going to give me more light because the aperture has made it darker. So now I'm going to go ahead and close this down to f8, it's giving me a shutter speed of 1/40th of a second, which is going to be really hard to keep this as a sharp shot because this lens isn't stabilized. So I'm going to go ahead and drop this back down to f2.8, and it's giving me 1/200th of a second. This is much nicer. Now I'm just going to adjust my composition slightly. Okay. And now go ahead and sit back, like hunch down a little bit, facing out that way. So versatile. So let's see here. So now again, I've opened back up. Go ahead and look at me like that. Give me that dead into the camera. A little bit of a smile.
So the camera is basically saying, okay, aperture is the priority for creative reasons. I'll try and technically adjust shutter speed to get what I think is the proper exposure.
Good, and this looks really pretty. And that's basically how aperture priority mode is shifting the shutter speed in my camera. But again, I'm not really getting the exposure I want, which is why I like to use manual control. But it can be convenient sometimes.
These two modes, shutter priority and aperture priority, are the most common semi-automatic modes photographers use. I know it can seem complicated at first, but with a little bit of practice, it's gonna click and you'll never forget it.
So when do you use manual mode? Now, I like to use manual mode most of the time, but I know this can be tedious for some people, and they would much rather just use an automatic or a semi-automatic mode to have the camera do all the heavy lifting. Now that's fine, but other than creative control, manual mode is very useful when you need to keep the same exposure on different photos. Remember that in aperture priority and shutter priority mode, the camera is going to be changing things based on the light levels that the camera is detecting. This can be a problem in situations where you need the exposure consistent. For example, panoramas. Now when you're shooting a panorama, you're going to shoot several photos to stitch together into one wider picture. So you want each of the photos to have the same exposure for each shot. If you have two photos that are one exposure and a third that is darker, you can have problems putting them together. You can fix this in your editing program, but it's much more convenient just to have them all at the same exposure to put together. So let's go ahead and do a panorama in aperture priority mode. It's a daylight panorama, and I know I want deep focus, so I'm going to set my camera to f8 and take my first shot where the sun is coming up in the east, and then I'll go left to right to take two more photos. So now, in aperture priority mode, I have three different exposures for something that needs to go together in one photo, which I now have to fix in the photo editing stage, and which is more difficult than just setting one exposure. So let's try that. I'm going to put the camera into manual mode, I'm going to keep my ISO as low as possible, around 100, and I know I want my aperture at f8. I'm going to take a couple test shots, so somewhere between 1/250th and 1/500th of a second is going to give me a nice exposure where I still have details on my brights and details on my shadows. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to take all the photos, and these three photos have a consistent exposure. Now, one trick I will tell you that landscape and architectural photographers do is that they start in aperture priority mode, they set their f-stop to f8 and take a photo and see what the shutter speed is, and if it looks nice, then they switch to manual mode and use that speed. This is just one example of where manual mode is helpful. It's also great for nighttime or indoor events or situations where you have lots of different lights around that are making your camera go crazy. But the real reason to stay in manual mode is the power to explore creative options and maintain control over your image. So what is exposure compensation? All right, well, most of the time in the semi-automatic modes, aperture value, time value, aperture priority, shutter priority, whatever you want to call it, you take your photo and the camera is going to calculate some of the factors of what the sensor is getting and compare them to numbers in a database inside of the chip in the camera, and it's going to go, this is the correct exposure. And maybe you're going to like what it does, or maybe you want it darker or brighter. Now each camera is slightly different, but most cameras have what's called exposure compensation. Now all that is a convenient way to darken or brighten your image by letting you quickly choose whether you want it darker or brighter, and then you can retake the photo. Usually it will look like a little plus or minus symbol somewhere on your camera or in your camera's menu, and you can simply select it and then choose to go lighter or choose to go darker. Voila, retake the photo, it's lighter or darker. But honestly, I think this is an additional tool that you can look up and learn more about later for your specific camera and as you practice. For now, I'd much rather have you playing in manual mode to get a good feel for how ISO, aperture, and shutter speed work together. Using manual mode is kind of like going to the photographic gym. It can be difficult and tiring at first, but the more you do it, the easier it goes. All right, so what are the other camera modes? Well, getting started, I really recommend just sticking with aperture priority, shutter priority, and manual mode. And once you have a good grasp on rapidly adjusting everything to get exposures you want, then maybe explore program mode, which is basically, as I said, automatic mode with benefits. You get full auto exposure, but you can change the different settings afterwards. Now, different cameras will have other modes like daylight, landscape, macro, portrait, sports, and others where the camera is going to make a bunch of decisions for you. So you can play with these other modes if you want. But with the aperture priority, shutter priority, and manual, you'll have much more creative control. And with just a little practice, I know you'll get it. And you'll start mastering how to use them to get consistent and properly exposed photos every time.